Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a huge difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. If this is your first time here and you're enjoying what you hear, consider subscribing. We've got plenty more mysteries to explore together. 13 ships cut through the Southern Ocean, their hulls groaning against the pack ice. Over 4,000 men, bundled against winds that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, watched as the white horizon grew closer. They were heading toward the most hostile environment on Earth. This wasn't an expedition. It was an invasion force. The mission was called Operation Highjump. The official story was simple. Cold weather training, equipment testing, mapping uncharted territory. 6 to 8 months of scientific work in the Antarctic summer. But 58 days later, the ships would turn around and flee north. Aircraft would be lost under circumstances that remain unexplained. Reports would be sealed, and the man who led the expedition, Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, would spend the rest of his life issuing warnings that made no sense for someone who had merely completed a training exercise. He would warn of threats from the polar regions. He would speak of future wars coming from the south. He would give interviews that were quickly buried, his words dismissed or ignored. What happened down there in the ice? What did they find that made the largest Antarctic expedition in history end so suddenly, so quietly, so completely? This is that story. Part 1. The fleet that shouldn't have been necessary. The war ended in August of 1945. By September, the American military was in full demobilization mode. Millions of men were being discharged, ships were being mothballed, aircraft were being scrapped or put into storage. The entire industrial war machine that had defeated Germany and Japan was winding down as fast as bureaucracy would allow. America was tired, Europe was in ruins, Japan was occupied, the Soviet Union was consolidating its grip on Eastern Europe. Nobody wanted another war. Nobody wanted more sacrifice. And yet, barely 14 months after the surrender of Japan, the United States Navy assembled one of the largest task forces since the end of the war. Destination Antarctica. The announcement came in November of 1946. The Navy would launch Operation Highjump, described as a comprehensive scientific and training expedition to Antarctica. The operation would test equipment in extreme cold, improve polar navigation techniques, map uncharted regions of the continent, and establish an American presence before other nations could claim strategic advantages. On paper it sounded reasonable, but the numbers told a different story. 13 ships. Not small research vessels, but major naval assets. The aircraft carrier Philippine Sea, a 27,000-ton Essex-class carrier that had served in the Pacific War. The submarine Senate, a Balao-class attack submarine. The destroyer Brownson, the icebreaker North Wind, seaplane tenders Pine Island and Currituck, cargo ships, tankers, supply vessels, each one representing millions of dollars in operational costs, over 4,000 personnel, not scientists, sailors, marines, pilots, combat veterans who had fought at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, who had sailed through kamikaze attacks, who knew what it meant to face death. 6 R-4D aircraft, the Navy version of the Douglas C-47 Skytrain, 6 Martin PBM Mariner flying boats, 6 helicopters, ground vehicles, prefabricated buildings, enough supplies and equipment to support a small city. This was not a research mission. This was a military deployment. The operation was divided into 3 task groups. Task Force 68, under the command of Rear Admiral Richard H. Cruzen, would handle overall naval operations. The central group would establish a base on the Ross Ice Shelf and conduct inland reconnaissance. The western group would explore and map the Pacific coast of Antarctica. The eastern group would chart the Indian Ocean coastline. Together they would photograph and map nearly 70% of the Antarctic coast, covering more than 1.5 million square miles. An area larger than India. Leading the entire operation was Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd Jr., the most famous polar explorer in American history. Byrd was a legend, a Naval Academy graduate who had learned to fly in World War I, a man who claimed to be the first to fly over the North Pole in 1926, though that claim would be disputed for decades. A man who had led multiple expeditions to Antarctica, discovering mountain ranges, establishing bases, spending a winter alone in a weather station where he nearly died from carbon monoxide poisoning. He had written books, given lectures, been featured in newsreels, appeared on radio programs. He was America's face of polar exploration, a genuine hero in an age when heroes mattered. But Byrd was not really in command of Operation Highjump, not entirely. Overall operational control fell to Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the man who had commanded the entire Pacific Fleet during World War II. Nimitz was not an explorer. He was a warrior, a strategist who had orchestrated the island-hopping campaign that destroyed the Japanese Navy, a man who understood power projection, logistics, and the calculated use of force. Why would the Navy place a wartime fleet admiral in charge of what was supposedly a peacetime scientific expedition? The official answer was simple. The Navy wanted to demonstrate readiness. They wanted to prove that American forces could deploy anywhere, operate in any environment, maintain supply lines across impossible distances. But there was another reason, one that wasn't advertised. The world was changing. Fast. The alliance with the Soviet Union was already fracturing. Churchill had given his Iron Curtain speech in March of 1946, warning that Europe was being divided. Soviet forces occupied eastern Germany, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. Communist parties were gaining strength in France and Italy. Stalin was making moves in Iran and Turkey, and both superpowers were racing to scoop up German scientists, engineers, and research data. Operation Paperclip was already underway. Werner von Braun and hundreds of other German rocket scientists were being brought to America. The Soviets were doing the same, capturing their own share of German expertise. Everyone wanted to know what Germany had been working on in the final years of the war, what wonder weapons had been in development, what technologies might give one side an advantage in the coming conflict. And some of that research, according to certain reports, had been conducted in the most remote location imaginable. Antarctica. The fleet departed Norfolk, Virginia on December 2nd, 1946. Crowds gathered to watch the ships leave. Newsreel cameras captured footage of sailors waving from the decks, aircraft secured on the carrier's flight deck, supplies being loaded in a choreographed dance of military precision. The public was told this was a bold scientific endeavour, a demonstration of American ingenuity and determination. Another victory for Admiral Byrd, the conqueror of the poles. But the sailors knew better. They had seen combat. They recognised the difference between a research mission and something else. This was something else. The first leg of the journey took them to Panama, through the canal, and down the western coast of South America. They stopped in Chile to refuel and resupply, and it was in Chile that Byrd gave his first interview about the mission. He was optimistic, confident. He spoke about the importance of polar research, about America's commitment to science, about the opportunities that Antarctica represented. But there was something in his words, a subtle undercurrent that wouldn't make sense until later. He mentioned that Antarctica represented the last unexplored frontier on Earth, that it was a place where anything might be discovered, that the expedition would push the boundaries of human knowledge, standard exploration rhetoric. Except for one phrase. He said that Antarctica might hold secrets that would change everything we thought we knew about the world. At the time, nobody paid much attention. Byrd was known for dramatic statements. He was selling the mission, generating public interest. But those words would echo differently after the ships returned. The task force reached Antarctic waters in late December. The ships pushed through increasingly heavy pack ice. The temperature dropped below zero. Wind speeds increased. The sky took on that peculiar quality unique to high latitudes, where the sun never quite sets but circles endlessly around the horizon, the men began to understand what they were facing. Antarctica is not like other cold places. It's not like winter in Alaska or Canada or Siberia. Those places have land, vegetation, some measure of shelter. Antarctica has none of that. It's a continent of ice sitting on bedrock surrounded by the coldest ocean on Earth. 98% of it is covered by ice sheets that are on average 1 mile thick. Some places the ice is over 2.5 miles deep. The coldest temperature ever recorded on Earth was measured in Antarctica. Minus 128.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to freeze fuel. Cold enough to shatter steel. Cold enough to kill a man in minutes if he's not properly protected. The winds are worse than the cold. Katabatic winds, formed when dense cold air flows down from the high interior plateau toward the coast, can exceed 200 miles per hour. They create whiteout conditions that make navigation impossible. They generate waves that can swamp ships. They turn flying into a form of suicide. And then there's the isolation. Antarctica is the most remote place on Earth. If something goes wrong, if you need rescue, if your ship sinks or your plane crashes, there's nobody coming. The nearest help is thousands of miles away, across the most violent ocean in the world. The men of Operation Highjump knew all this. They had been briefed. They had trained. They thought they were prepared. But knowing about Antarctica and experiencing Antarctica are two very different things. On December 26th, the Central Group began establishing Little America 4 on the Ross Ice Shelf. This would be the main base of operations, the staging point for flights into the interior. The location had been chosen carefully. Byrd had established previous Little America bases in this region during his earlier expeditions in the 1920s and 30s. The Ross Ice Shelf is a massive platform of floating ice, roughly the size of France, extending from the coast into the Ross Sea. It's relatively flat, stable enough to support buildings and aircraft, and provides access to the interior via natural pathways through the mountains. Prefabricated structures were unloaded from the ships and assembled on the ice. Quonset huts for housing, buildings for operations, communications, supplies, aircraft hangars, fuel depots, a small city rising from the frozen wasteland. It was brutally difficult work. Men worked in shifts, taking breaks to warm up before going back out. Equipment froze. Engines wouldn't start. Metal became brittle and broke. Every task took 3 times longer than it would have in normal conditions, but they made progress. By early January, Little America 4 was operational. The base had power, heat, communications. Aircraft were assembled and tested. Seaplanes from the Pine Island and Currituck began flying reconnaissance missions along the coast, and then came the deep penetration flights. Part 2. Into the White Hell. Lieutenant Commander William Kearns was a pilot with extensive experience in cold weather operations. He had flown in Alaska. He understood ice, wind, and the unique challenges of polar aviation. On January 11th, 1947, Kearns took off from the North Wind in a small helicopter to scout for better landing sites for cargo operations. The weather was marginal, but acceptable. Visibility was reasonable. He had radio contact with the ship. 20 minutes later, his helicopter disappeared. Radio contact was lost. Search aircraft were launched, but found nothing. The helicopter had simply vanished into the white landscape. Kearns was alone, somewhere on the Antarctic ice with minimal supplies and no shelter. The temperature was below zero. Winds were increasing. A storm was moving in. He should have died within hours. Everyone assumed he was dead. But 6 weeks later, Kearns walked back into Little America 4. He was frostbitten, emaciated, barely able to walk. He had survived by finding a crevasse that provided shelter from the wind, by rationing the little food he had, by melting ice for water, by sheer force of will. When he was debriefed, Kearns described his experience in detail. The cold, the wind, the absolute isolation, the knowledge that he was utterly alone in the most hostile place on Earth. But there was something else in his report, something that was noted but not emphasized. During his time on the ice, Kearns reported seeing lights in the sky. Not the aurora australis, which he knew well. Something else. Lights that moved in ways that didn't match aircraft or natural phenomena. He was questioned about this. The debriefers wanted details. What did the lights look like? How did they move? How far away were they? Kearns couldn't be specific. He admitted that his mental state was compromised by starvation and cold. He said he might have hallucinated. The report was noted and filed away. But it wasn't the last time personnel from Operation Highjump would report unusual lights. While Kearns was lost on the ice, the main operations of Highjump were proceeding. The seaplane tenders Pine Island and Currituck were conducting extensive photographic reconnaissance along the coast. The Martin PBM mariners would take off from the water, fly low over the coastline, and photograph everything they saw. These were dangerous flights. The mariners were big, slow aircraft. They were vulnerable to wind shear and icing. If an engine failed, if the weather turned bad, if something went wrong, there was nowhere to land. The pilots would have to ditch in the freezing ocean and hope for rescue before hypothermia killed them. On January 30th, a mariner designated George I took off from the Pine Island for a routine coastal reconnaissance mission. The crew consisted of 9 men, led by Lieutenant Commander Ralph Frenchy LeBlanc. The weather was deteriorating, but still within acceptable limits. The George I flew along the coast, taking photographs, maintaining radio contact. Then, around noon, the weather turned savage. A blizzard swept in from the interior, visibility dropped to 0, winds exceeded 70 miles per hour. The George I tried to return to the Pine Island. Radio contact became intermittent. The last transmission was LeBlanc reporting heavy turbulence and icing, then silence. Search aircraft were launched as soon as the weather permitted. They found wreckage scattered across the ice. The George I had crashed. 3 men were killed on impact. The other 6 survived, but they were stranded miles from any help. Rescue operations began immediately. Aircraft dropped supplies. Ships tried to reach the crash site, but were blocked by ice. The survivors huddled in the wreckage, burning whatever they could for heat, rationing emergency supplies. It took 3 days to reach them. 3 days in the Antarctic cold with inadequate shelter, knowing that every hour increased the risk of death from exposure. All 6 survivors were eventually rescued, but several suffered severe frostbite. 1 man lost parts of both feet to amputation. The official report listed the cause of the crash as extreme weather and pilot error. LeBlanc had pushed too far into deteriorating conditions. He had made a judgment call that turned out to be wrong, but some of the survivors told a different story. According to their accounts, which were included in initial debriefing reports, but later removed from official documents, the George I encountered something in the storm, something that interfered with their instruments, something that caused the engines to sputter and lose power. They described seeing shapes in the clouds, objects that moved independently of the wind, reflections of light that shouldn't have been there. Again, the reports were attributed to stress and the disorienting nature of Antarctic weather. Whiteout conditions can create optical illusions. Desperate men see what they want to see or fear to see. The reports were noted and filed. The official narrative remained unchanged. Pilot error, bad weather, a tragic but understandable accident. But then came Richard Byrd's flight. Part 3. The flight that changed everything. On February 19th, 1947, Rear Admiral Richard Byrd boarded a ski-equipped R-4D aircraft at Little America 4. The aircraft was designated Pine Island Express, piloted by Lieutenant Commander David Bunger. The mission was ambitious: fly south from the Ross Ice Shelf, penetrate deep into the Antarctic interior, conduct photographic reconnaissance of unexplored territory, and return before fuel ran low. It would be the longest and deepest penetration flight of Operation Highjump. A chance to see what lay beyond the coastal mountains, beyond the regions that previous expeditions had mapped. Byrd had made similar flights before. In 1929, during his first Antarctic expedition, he had flown over the South Pole itself, becoming one of the first men to do so. He understood the risks. He knew what could go wrong, but this flight would be different. The R Force D took off at 0700 hours. Weather conditions were excellent. Clear skies, low winds, temperature at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which was practically warm by Antarctic standards. The aircraft climbed to 10,000 feet and turned south. Below them, the Ross ice shelf stretched away like an endless frozen ocean. Ahead, the Transantarctic mountains rose like a wall, their peaks jutting above the ice, sharp and black against the white landscape. Bird sat in the co-pilot seat, watching the terrain pass beneath them. He had a camera mounted to the window, taking photographs at regular intervals. Other crew members operated additional cameras, mapping equipment and scientific instruments. The flight plan called for them to cross the mountains through a pass, and then fly inland for several hours, photographing whatever they found. The interior of Antarctica was largely unknown. Satellite imagery didn't exist. The only way to map the continent was to fly over it and take pictures. They crossed the mountains without incident. On the far side, the terrain changed dramatically. Instead of ice shelf, they saw high plateau, vast expanses of ice broken by exposed rock formations, mountain ranges jutting up from the frozen surface, valleys and crevasses that appeared to drop into bottomless darkness. Bird noted landmarks, compared them to previous maps, tried to orient himself, but this was virgin territory. Nothing he saw matched anything in the charts. 2 hours into the flight, as they approached what Bird estimated to be 85 degrees south, something changed. The instruments began acting strangely. The magnetic compass, which was already unreliable at high latitudes, started spinning. The altimeter fluctuated. Radio contact with Little America became distorted, filled with static and interference. Bunga the pilot reported the instrument problems. He suggested they turn back, that something was wrong with the aircraft's electrical systems. But Bird wanted to continue. They had come this far. The weather was good. They had fuel for another hour of exploration. They flew on. And then, according to accounts that emerged decades later, they saw something that shouldn't have existed. The official flight logs from February 19th are sparse. They record the takeoff time, the route flown, the time aloft, and the landing back at Little America. Total flight time, 6 hours and 13 minutes. Distance covered, approximately 1,700 miles. But there's a gap in the logs. A period of roughly 45 minutes where no entries were made. No notes about terrain observed. No photographs logged. Nothing. After Bird's death in 1957, a document began circulating among researchers interested in Antarctic mysteries. The document was presented as a diary entry from Bird's personal journal, dated February 19th, 1947. The diary entry described what happened during that 45-minute gap. According to this document, the R4D encountered unusual atmospheric conditions as they flew deeper inland. The air became warmer, the instruments went haywire, and ahead of them, the landscape changed. The diary described seeing a valley not covered in ice, vegetation, flowing water, and then something that defied all logic. Aircraft, but not conventional aircraft. Disc-shaped craft that moved at incredible speed, performing manoeuvres that no known plane could achieve. Vertical ascent, instant acceleration, flight patterns that seemed to ignore basic physics. The diary claimed that one of these craft paced the R4D, flying alongside at close range. That radio contact was established, though the source of the transmission was unclear, that Bird was instructed to follow the craft. According to the diary, Bunga had no choice. When he tried to turn away, the aircraft's controls became unresponsive. They were being guided remotely by whatever intelligence was controlling the craft. They were led to a landing site. The diary described it as a massive opening in the ice, leading down into what appeared to be a subterranean world. Warm air rising from below, light that didn't come from the sun. The R4D landed according to this account. Bird and his crew were met by figures described as tall, blonde, and speaking in accented English. They claimed to represent a civilization that had been observing humanity's development. They expressed concern about humanity's recent use of atomic weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They warned that continued nuclear testing could have catastrophic consequences. Byrd was given a message to deliver to the leaders of the surface world, a warning about the destructive path humanity was taking, an offer of assistance if humanity chose a different course. And then, according to the diary, Byrd was escorted back to his aircraft and released. The flight back to Little America was uneventful, but he was informed that his report would not be believed, that he would be silenced, that the world was not ready for the truth. Mainstream historians and researchers dismiss this diary as a complete fabrication. They point out multiple problems with it. First, the diary didn't surface until decades after Byrd's death, making authentication impossible. Second, the writing style doesn't match Byrd's known journals and reports. Third, many of the details seem to be borrowed from science fiction stories popular in the 1950s and 60s. Fourth, there's no corroborating evidence from any of the crew members who were supposedly on the flight. The diary is almost certainly fake, a hoax created to feed conspiracy theories about Hollow Earth, Nazi bases, and alien contact. But here's the problem. Some of the geographic features described in the diary match real locations in Antarctica that were not publicly known until satellite mapping became available in the 1970s and 80s. The diary mentioned specific mountain ranges, valleys and ice formations that would have been nearly impossible for a forger to know about unless they had access to classified reconnaissance data. And there's another problem. Richard Byrd's behaviour after Operation Highjump. If the mission had been routine, if nothing unusual had happened, you would expect Byrd to return home, write reports, give lectures, and continue his career as America's foremost polar explorer. But that's not what happened. Part 4. The warning nobody wanted to hear. On March 5th, 1947, barely a week after returning from Antarctica, Richard Byrd gave an interview to Lee Van Atta, a reporter for International News Service. The interview was conducted in Chile, where the task force had stopped to refuel before the final leg home. The interview was published in El Mercurio, a Chilean newspaper, on March 5th. The headline read, "Admiral Richard E. Byrd refers to strategic importance of the poles." In the interview, Byrd made a series of statements that seemed bizarre for someone who had just completed a training and mapping exercise. He said, and this is a direct quote from the translation of the article, "It is necessary for the United States to take defensive actions against enemy air fighters which come from the polar regions. The United States must adopt measures of protection against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile aircraft proceeding from the polar regions." He elaborated, saying that in the case of a future war, America could be attacked by aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at tremendous speeds. These statements made no sense in context. Who was going to attack America from Antarctica? The nearest hostile nation, the Soviet Union, was in the Northern Hemisphere. There were no military bases in Antarctica, no aircraft capable of the kind of pole-to-pole flight Byrd was describing. What was he talking about? The interview received a limited coverage in the United States. A few newspapers picked it up, but it was largely buried beneath other post-war news. Most readers who saw it probably assumed Byrd was talking about the Soviet threat, about the possibility of long-range bombers flying over the North Pole to attack American cities. But Byrd specifically mentioned both poles. He emphasized Antarctica. He spoke of aircraft with capabilities that exceeded anything in the known arsenals of any nation. When questioned about the statements, later Byrd was evasive. He said he had been misquoted, that the translation from English to Spanish and back had distorted his meaning, that he was simply emphasizing the strategic importance of polar regions in general. But the original article exists. The quotes are there. Whatever Byrd meant, he said something about Antarctic threats that he would spend the rest of his life trying to clarify, downplay or avoid discussing entirely. The Navy's official response was silence. No comment on Byrd's statements. No clarification of what he meant. No correction if he had been misquoted. Just silence. Operation Highjump officially ended in late February of 1947. The ships returned to the United States in April. The personnel were debriefed, demobilised and sent home or reassigned to other duties. The mission was declared a success. Nearly 70,000 aerial photographs had been taken, mapping vast stretches of previously unknown coastline. Valuable data had been gathered on cold weather operations. Equipment had been tested in extreme conditions. But the operation had ended 2 months earlier than planned. The official explanation was weather and logistical challenges. But insiders knew that wasn't the full story. Aircraft losses had been higher than expected. The George 1 crash was public knowledge, but other incidents were not reported. There were rumours of additional aircraft that had been damaged or lost, records that didn't quite add up, flight logs with unexplained gaps. Personnel injuries were another issue. Several men had suffered severe frostbite. Others had psychological issues, what we would now recognise as PTSD but was then dismissed as weakness or nerves. Some men reported nightmares. Others refused to talk about their experiences. The after-action reports were classified. Not unusual for military operations, but the level of classification seemed excessive for what was supposed to be a scientific and training mission. Specific sections were marked above top secret. Access was restricted to a small number of officials. Even requesting to see the reports required special clearance. Why? The Navy's answer was strategic sensitivity. The reports contained information about naval capabilities, operational procedures, and equipment performance that could be valuable to potential adversaries. Standard security protocol. But researchers who later gained partial access to declassified versions of the reports noticed something strange. The redactions weren't limited to technical data or operational details. Entire sections describing specific flights and observations were blacked out. Place names were removed. Personnel names were deleted. It looked less like protecting military secrets and more like hiding something embarrassing or inexplicable. Richard Byrd remained in the Navy after Highjump. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1947. He participated in various naval functions and continued to advise on polar operations, but he never led another major Antarctic expedition. He participated in later missions like Operation Deep Freeze in 1955, but always in a supporting or advisory role. He gave fewer public lectures. He wrote less. He seemed to withdraw from the public spotlight that had defined much of his earlier career. Those who knew him personally said he changed after Highjump. He became more serious, more guarded. He would avoid certain topics in conversation. If asked directly about what he saw in Antarctica, he would give vague answers or change the subject. Something had happened to Richard Byrd in Antarctica. Whether it was what the fake diary described or something else entirely, he carried it with him for the rest of his life, and he was not allowed to talk about it. Part 5. The theory that won't die. Nazi Germany's interest in Antarctica began long before World War II. In the 1930s, Germany's whaling industry was among the most productive in the world. Whale oil was valuable for making margarine, soap, and industrial lubricants. The richest whaling grounds were in the waters around Antarctica. But Germany's interest went beyond commercial whaling. There were strategic considerations as well. In 1938 and 39, a German expedition led by Captain Alfred Richter conducted extensive aerial reconnaissance of a region in Antarctica called Queen Maud Land. The expedition used a converted aircraft carrier, the Schwabenland, equipped with special catapult-launched seaplanes. The aircraft flew over thousands of square miles of territory, taking photographs, dropping German flags with swastika emblems, claiming the region for the Third Reich. They named it Neuschwabenland, New Swabia. The official purpose was to support German whaling operations and establish territorial claims before other nations could do so. But conspiracy theories suggest something more. Some researchers believe the Germans discovered something in Neuschwabenland. Natural caverns beneath the ice, geothermal vents providing warmth, areas where a base could be established away from the brutal surface conditions. According to these theories, Germany began constructing a secret research facility in Antarctica before the war began. When it became clear that Germany was losing in Europe, resources and personnel were supposedly evacuated to this facility to continue advanced research projects. The most common version of this theory focuses on flying disc technology. Germany did experiment with unconventional aircraft designs during the war. The Horten brothers developed flying wing designs. BMW and other companies researched vertical takeoff aircraft. There were projects with code names like Vril and Haunebu that supposedly involved disc-shaped craft. Most mainstream historians consider these projects to be either complete fabrications or wildly exaggerated accounts of conventional research. The few documents that reference unusual aircraft designs show concepts that never progressed beyond the blueprint stage. But conspiracy theorists argue that the real research was conducted in Antarctica, away from Allied bombing raids and intelligence gathering, that the disc technology was successfully developed and tested in the isolated environment of Neuschwabenland, and that when Operation Highjump arrived in early 1947, American forces encountered this technology. The theory suggests that reconnaissance flights from Highjump penetrated into German-held territory, that they discovered the base, that they were intercepted by advanced craft capable of outmaneuvering conventional aircraft, that aircraft were damaged or destroyed, that the Navy realised they were facing an opponent with superior technology, that they withdrew to avoid further losses and began developing countermeasures. This theory has several problems. First, there's the logistical impossibility of maintaining a secret Antarctic base. Such a facility would require constant resupply. Food, fuel, equipment, personnel rotations. Ships would have to make regular trips from South America or Africa. These voyages would be noticed. No evidence exists of regular German shipping to Antarctica after 1945. No reports of suspicious vessels. No fuel consumption records that suggest such operations. Second, there's the technological leap required. Even if Germany had been working on advanced propulsion systems, developing functional aircraft that could defeat American planes in combat would require enormous resources, extensive testing, and time, all while isolated in the most hostile environment on Earth. Third, there's the question of motivation. If Germany had such advanced technology, why didn't they use it during the war? Why wait until after defeat to demonstrate capabilities that could have changed the outcome of the conflict? The standard answer from conspiracy theorists is that the technology wasn't ready until after the war ended, that it required years of development in the Antarctic facility before becoming operational. But this stretches credulity. However, there is one detail that keeps this theory alive. In 1947, shortly after Operation Highjump ended, the United States military began encountering what they initially called flying discs. The Kenneth Arnold sighting in June, where a pilot reported seeing 9 unusual craft near Mount Rainier. The Roswell incident in July, where something crashed in the New Mexico desert, and the military initially announced they had recovered a flying disc before quickly retracting the statement. Throughout the late 1940s and early 50s, military and civilian pilots reported encountering disc-shaped craft with extraordinary performance characteristics, objects that could accelerate faster than jets, objects that could hover, then shoot away at impossible speeds, objects that seemed to ignore the laws of physics. The Air Force launched Project Sign in 1948 to investigate these reports. Project Sign concluded that some of the sightings represented technology beyond known human capabilities. The report, known as the Estimate of the Situation, suggested that the objects might be extraterrestrial. This conclusion was rejected by Air Force leadership. Project Sign was replaced by Project Grudge, which took a more skeptical approach, attributing most sightings to misidentifications, hoaxes, or psychological factors. But the sightings continued, and some of them came from Antarctica. Research stations established in Antarctica during the International Geophysical Year in 1957 and 58 reported unusual aerial phenomena. Lights moving across the sky, objects that appeared on radar but had no known source, craft that seemed to observe the stations before departing at high speed. Most of these reports were dismissed as atmospheric phenomena, the aurora australis, ice crystals in the air creating optical illusions, reflections from the sun or moon. But experienced observers, people who had spent years in Antarctica and knew what natural phenomena looked like, insisted that what they saw was something else. Which brings us to an even stranger theory. What if the craft encountered during Operation Highjump weren't German at all? What if they were never human? Part 6. The possibility nobody wants to consider Antarctica is the most isolated continent on Earth. It has no permanent human population. Until the mid-20th century, it was almost completely unexplored. Even today, vast regions remain unmapped at ground level. If you were a non-human intelligence and you wanted a base of operations on Earth, a place where you could conduct activities without human interference, Antarctica would be ideal. The environment is hostile enough to discourage casual exploration. The isolation ensures that any facility could operate for extended periods without detection. The ice provides natural concealment, and the international treaty system that emerged in the 1950s effectively restricts military presence and limits access. This is, of course, pure speculation, but let's examine what we know. Richard Byrd warned of threats from the polar regions. He specifically mentioned aircraft capable of flying pole to pole at tremendous speeds. He emphasised Antarctica as a potential source of danger. Why would he say this if the threats were conventional? If he was concerned about Soviet expansion, he would have said so. If he was worried about German holdouts, he would have been specific. Instead, he used vague language. He spoke of capabilities that exceeded known technology. He framed Antarctica itself as a source of danger, not just a location where hostile forces might operate. The classified sections of Operation Highjump reports remain sealed. Some documents have been declassified over the years, but key sections are still redacted or restricted. For a mission that ended over 70 years ago, the continued secrecy is unusual. What could possibly still require protection? If the mission was simply a training exercise that failed due to bad weather and equipment problems, there would be no need for ongoing classification. Technical details about 1940s-era equipment would be obsolete. Strategic assessments of Antarctic geography would be superseded by modern satellite imagery. Unless the classified sections contain information that remains sensitive because it describes something that still exists, something that governments still monitor, something that still represents an unknown. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, barely 12 years after Operation Highjump. The treaty effectively demilitarized the entire continent. No weapons testing, no military bases, no territorial claims enforced. The United States and Soviet Union, locked in the most intense geopolitical rivalry in human history, agreed to completely neutralize Antarctica. Think about that. Two superpowers, racing to build nuclear arsenals, competing for influence on every continent, agreed that Antarctica would be off limits. Why? The official answer is scientific cooperation and environmental protection, both noble goals, but consider the alternatives. What if both nations discovered something in Antarctica? What if they independently encountered the same phenomenon that Operation Highjump encountered? What if they realised that military activity in Antarctica was either futile or dangerous? What if the treaty wasn't designed to protect Antarctica from humanity, but to protect humanity from making a terrible mistake in Antarctica? This is where we enter the realm of high speculation. But the questions remain valid. If non-human intelligence was operating in Antarctica, what would they want? Why would they tolerate human presence in research stations, but restrict deeper exploration? One theory suggests that Antarctica serves as a monitoring station, that the non-human presence is observational, not interventional, that they allow limited human activity but discourage military operations or extensive resource extraction. This would explain why research stations are allowed to operate, why scientific expeditions are approved, but why certain regions remain off limits, why permits for independent exploration are difficult to obtain, why satellite imagery of some areas is restricted or low resolution. Another theory is darker. It suggests that Antarctica contains something ancient, something that predates human civilization, something buried beneath the ice that certain powers want to keep hidden. Antarctica was not always frozen. Geological evidence shows that millions of years ago the continent had a temperate climate. Forests grew there, animals lived there, and then as tectonic plates shifted and ocean currents changed, Antarctica migrated to the South Pole and began to freeze. What if something existed in Antarctica before the ice? What if structures, technology, or knowledge lies buried beneath miles of ice? What if Operation Highjump was not the first to discover this, but merely the most recent? Ancient civilization theories are popular in fringe research. The idea that advanced cultures existed before recorded history, that they possessed knowledge or technology that was lost when they collapsed, that evidence of these civilizations remains hidden in remote locations. Antarctica is a natural candidate for such theories. It's isolated, it's largely unexplored, and anything beneath the ice would be perfectly preserved, frozen in time. But these theories require accepting that mainstream archaeology and history are fundamentally wrong. That there were advanced civilizations before Sumer and Egypt, that they left no trace except in the most remote and inaccessible locations. Possible? Perhaps. Likely. That's harder to argue. But what if we're asking the wrong questions? What if the presence in Antarctica is not ancient but recent? What if it's not buried but active? What if it's not historical but ongoing? What if something lives in Antarctica, and Operation Highjump was the first time modern humanity encountered it directly? Part 7. The silence that followed. After Operation Highjump ended, and the controversy around bird statements faded from the news, Antarctica disappeared from public consciousness. There were no major expeditions for several years. The Navy conducted limited operations, maintaining weather stations and conducting basic research, but nothing on the scale of Highjump, and then came the International Geophysical Year. In 1957 and 1958, the international scientific community organised a massive coordinated research effort spanning the entire globe. The goal was to gather data on everything from solar activity to ocean currents to polar ice. Antarctica was a major focus. 12 nations established research stations on the continent. The United States built several bases, including McMurdo Station on Ross Island and the Amundsen Scott Station at the South Pole itself. Richard Byrd participated in the early stages of this effort as part of Operation Deep Freeze, the military operation that supported the scientific missions. He flew to Antarctica one last time in January of 1956, but his role was ceremonial. He attended the dedication of the new stations. He posed for photographs. He gave brief statements to the press about the importance of international cooperation, and then he returned home. Byrd died on March 11th, 1957, at the age of 68. The official cause of death was heart disease. He had lived a hard life. The years of cold, isolation, and physical hardship had taken their toll. His funeral was attended by dignitaries, fellow explorers, and military officials. He was eulogized as a hero of American exploration, a man who had pushed the boundaries of human achievement. But some who knew him said he died with unfinished business, that there were things he had wanted to say but couldn't, that he had been constrained by classification orders, by political pressure, by the weight of secrets he wasn't allowed to share. His personal papers were donated to the Byrd Polar Research Center at Ohio State University. Researchers have examined them extensively. His journals, his correspondence, his official reports. Nothing in the public archive supports the conspiracy theories. There are no references to underground civilizations or advanced craft or warnings from non-human intelligence. But there are gaps, periods where Byrd's personal journal has no entries, days unaccounted for, and in his later years, cryptic references to things he had seen but couldn't discuss. In a letter to a friend written in 1955, Byrd mentioned that he had knowledge that would shake the world if it were revealed, that he hoped someday the truth could be told, that future generations would understand what his generation had faced. What did he mean? Was it just the musings of an aging explorer reflecting on his legacy, or was it something more? We will never know. What we do know is that Antarctica remains restricted. The treaty holds, military activity is banned, independent exploration is tightly controlled. Satellite imagery has revealed the continent in unprecedented detail. We can see mountain ranges, valleys, lakes beneath the ice, the flow patterns of glaciers. But there are limits to what satellites can detect. Ice is opaque to most sensors. Ground-penetrating radar can help, but coverage is limited and expensive. Most of Antarctica's subterranean features remain unknown, and there are regions where satellite imagery is deliberately restricted or delayed before public release, areas where coverage is lower resolution than it should be. zones where access requires special permissions. Why? The official answer is always the same: environmental protection, scientific integrity, preventing contamination of pristine ecosystems. All reasonable, all true to an extent. But when you combine these restrictions with the history of Operation Highjump, with the sealed records and unexplained incidents, with Byrd's warnings and the rapid establishment of the Antarctic Treaty, a pattern emerges. Antarctica is hiding something, and those in power want it to stay hidden. Part 8. What the evidence actually tells us. Let's step back from speculation and focus on what we can verify. Operation Highjump happened. This is undisputed fact. Over 4,000 personnel deployed to Antarctica in December of 1946. The operation was real, large-scale, and officially sanctioned. The operation ended early. This is also documented. The mission was planned for 6 to 8 months. It ended after 8 weeks. The Navy cited weather and logistical challenges. Aircraft were lost. The George I crash is well documented. Other incidents are mentioned in various reports, but with less detail. The exact number of aircraft lost or damaged remains unclear due to incomplete records. Richard Byrd made unusual statements after returning. The El Mercurio interview is real. The quotes about threats from the polar regions exist in the original article. Byrd later tried to downplay or recontextualize his statements. Substantial portions of Operation Highjump documentation remain classified. This can be verified by requesting documents through Freedom of Information Act. You will receive heavily redacted versions with key sections withheld. The Antarctic Treaty was signed and enforced. This is historical fact. The treaty remains in effect today, with nearly every nation on Earth as a signatory. These facts don't prove any specific conspiracy theory, but they do prove that something unusual happened. A massive military operation was launched, ended abruptly, and was followed by decades of secrecy and restrictions. The commander of that operation issued warnings that didn't fit the official narrative, and the location where it happened remains the most controlled territory on Earth. Now let's consider the theories. Theory 1. Official story. The mission was routine, ended due to predictable challenges, and the secrecy is just standard military protocol. This theory has problems. The Navy planned extensively. They knew the challenges. Ending early was expensive and embarrassing. Byrd's warnings don't fit. The continued classification after 70 years doesn't make sense. Theory 2. German holdouts. Nazi remnants operated from Antarctica with advanced technology, which American forces encountered and couldn't defeat. This theory has bigger problems. The logistics of maintaining a secret base are implausible. The technology gap is too large. No evidence of resupply operations exists. The timeline doesn't work. Theory 3. Non-human contact. Operation Highjump encountered evidence of non-human intelligence operating in Antarctica. This theory is the most extraordinary, and thus requires the most evidence. But it explains everything: the scale of the operation, the early termination, Byrd's warnings, the classification, the treaty, the ongoing restrictions. The problem is the same problem that faces all extraordinary claims. Where's the proof? If non-human intelligence is operating in Antarctica, where are the clear photographs? Where are the recovered artifacts? Where are the first-hand testimonies from credible witnesses? The answer conspiracy theorists give is that such evidence exists but is classified, that witnesses have been silenced, that recovered materials are held in secure facilities, but this is unfalsifiable. You can't prove something doesn't exist if all evidence of its non-existence can be dismissed as part of the cover-up. So we're left with questions and incomplete answers. Something happened during Operation Highjump. Something significant enough to end a major operation early. Something classified enough that records remain sealed. Something important enough that an international treaty was negotiated to restrict military activity on an entire continent. What was it? Unless the classified files are opened, unless witnesses come forward with verifiable evidence, unless someone decides that the truth is more important than the secret, we may never know with certainty, but the questions endure, and Antarctica keeps its secrets. Part 9. The loose ends that don't tie up. There are details about Operation Highjump that don't fit any neat narrative. Small things that get overlooked in the big conspiracy theories but might actually be the most telling. Start with the personnel. Over 4,000 men participated in Highjump. Most of them were regular Navy personnel, sailors doing their jobs, pilots flying missions, engineers maintaining equipment. When they came home, they went on with their lives, got discharged or reassigned, married, had families, lived normal post-war American lives. And yet, decades later, some of them talked about strange experiences. Not in official testimony, not in formal interviews, but in conversations with family members, in letters, in diaries that surfaced after they died. There are dozens of accounts from Highjump veterans describing unusual phenomena. Lights in the sky, equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained, orders to avoid certain areas without explanation, debriefings where they were told never to discuss specific incidents. These accounts are anecdotal, they can't be verified, but they're consistent. Independent witnesses describing similar experiences without coordination. Consider the case of John Searson, a Navy photographer assigned to one of the Martin mariners during the coastal reconnaissance missions. Searson kept a detailed personal journal during Highjump separate from official logs. After his death in the 1990s, his family donated his papers to a military history archive. The journal contains routine observations about weather, base life, and photography assignments, but there are 3 pages that have been carefully torn out. Not roughly, as if damaged, but deliberately, cleanly removed. The pages before and after the gap contain entries dated January 16th and January 23rd, 1947. What was on those missing pages? What did Searson see during that week that he later decided should not be preserved? We can't know, but the missing pages tell us that something happened worth hiding. Then there's the issue of the submarine Senate. Why was a submarine part of Operation Highjump? The official answer is ice reconnaissance. The Senate was supposed to test submarine operations in Antarctic waters, gather data on ice formations from below, and evaluate the feasibility of under-ice navigation. But the Senate's patrol routes, as documented in declassified materials, show some unusual patterns. The submarine spent significant time in areas that would have been more appropriate for surface ships. It conducted multiple deep dives in regions where ice reconnaissance would be less valuable. What was the Senate looking for? Why would you need a submarine for a mapping mission? One theory is that the Senate was searching for underwater entrances to subterranean facilities, that if there were hidden bases beneath the Antarctic ice, they would need access from the sea, that the Senate's mission was to locate these access points. Pure speculation, but the submarine's presence and activities remain unexplained. Another loose end, the film footage. Operation Highjump included several photographers and cameramen who shot thousands of feet of film. Much of this footage was used in a Navy documentary called The Secret Land, released in 1948. The documentary is stiff propaganda, typical of the era. It shows brave American servicemen battling the elements, conducting important scientific work, demonstrating American prowess in the most hostile environment on Earth. But several people who worked on the film later said that significant footage was cut from the final version. Scenes that were shot but never included. Film that disappeared or was classified. What was in those scenes? Why was it removed? One former editor claimed in an interview in the 1980s that he had seen footage of aircraft flying over terrain that looked wrong for Antarctica. Green valleys, flowing water, areas that should have been frozen but weren't. He said the footage was confusing because it didn't match any known Antarctic geography. He was told the film had been mislabeled, that it was from another expedition, that it shouldn't have been in the Highjump material, but he insisted he saw it. And it bothered him for decades. Again, this is second-hand testimony from someone recalling events decades later, unreliable by any standard. But it's another piece of the pattern. There's also the question of subsequent expeditions. After Highjump ended and the treaty was signed, Antarctic exploration continued. Research stations were established. Scientists conducted studies, expeditions mapped previously unknown regions, and some of these expeditions reported unusual findings. In 1964, a Soviet expedition to the Vostok region, one of the most isolated parts of Antarctica, discovered a massive subglacial lake beneath the ice. Lake Vostok is one of the largest lakes in the world, roughly the size of Lake Ontario. It's buried under more than 2 miles of ice and has been isolated from the surface for millions of years. The discovery was fascinating from a scientific standpoint. The lake might contain unique ecosystems. It might hold clues about ancient climates. It represents a sealed environment unlike anything else on Earth. But drilling into Lake Vostok has been controversial. Some scientists worry about contamination. Others argue that the lake should be left pristine for future generations with better technology. And some whisper that there are other reasons for the restrictions. That early drill samples revealed something unexpected. That Lake Vostok is not just an isolated lake, but potentially something more. These whispers are unverifiable, but they persist. Another incident occurred in 1980, when a Navy flight crew conducting routine reconnaissance reported encountering severe electromagnetic interference over a region of Queen Maud Land. Their instruments failed, radio contact was lost, the aircraft barely made it back to base. The incident was investigated. The official conclusion was equipment malfunction, possibly caused by unusual atmospheric conditions. But the crew insisted they had seen something. A structure on the ice that didn't match any known facility. Something that looked artificial, but wasn't on any map. When a follow-up flight was sent to investigate, the structure, if it ever existed, was not found. The official report stated that the crew had likely seen a natural ice formation distorted by atmospheric refraction. Case closed. Or was it? These incidents pile up over decades. None definitively proves anything. Each can be explained away individually, but collectively they create a mosaic of strangeness surrounding Antarctica. Why do so many unusual reports come from one location? Why do instruments malfunction more frequently there than in other remote regions? Why do experienced observers report phenomena they can't explain? The standard answer is environmental factors. Antarctica is extreme. Cold affects equipment. Isolation affects perception. Psychological stress creates misinterpretations. All true, all reasonable, but all also potentially convenient excuses for dismissing reports that suggest something more complicated. Part 10. The truth that remains buried. We've covered a lot of ground. The facts of Operation Highjump, Richard Byrd's warnings, the theories about German holdouts and non-human contact, the treaty that locked down the continent, the loose ends that don't quite fit. Now we need to ask, what's the most likely truth? Let's be honest. The most likely explanation is the boring one. Operation Highjump was a badly planned mission that encountered difficulties and ended early. Byrd was concerned about Cold War threats and expressed them poorly. The classification is bureaucratic inertia. The treaty was rational diplomacy. Antarctica is weird because it's Antarctica. This explanation requires no conspiracy, no hidden technology, no non-human intelligence, just human error, bad luck, and the tendency of people to see patterns where none exist. But here's what bothers me, and maybe it bothers you too. The scale of resources invested in Highjump doesn't match a simple mapping mission. The early termination doesn't match standard military procedure for weather-related challenges. Byrd's specific warnings about threats from the poles don't match concerns about the Soviet Union. The continued classification decades later doesn't match typical document retention policies. The Antarctic Treaty's comprehensive restrictions don't match the strategic value of an empty frozen continent. Each of these things has a conventional explanation, but when you line them all up, the conventional explanations start to feel forced. It's like being told that a series of coincidences just happen to align in a very specific pattern. Possible? Yes. Probable? That's harder to accept. So let's consider a middle ground. A theory that doesn't require believing in flying saucers or lost civilizations, but acknowledges that something unusual happened. Here's the middle ground theory. Operation Highjump discovered something in Antarctica, not technology, not intelligence, but a natural phenomenon that was strategically significant. Maybe a massive mineral deposit, uranium or rare earth elements, resources that would become critically important in the coming decades. Maybe a geographic feature with military applications, a natural harbour that could support submarine bases, a location perfect for secret installations, maybe evidence of geological instability, signs that portions of the ice sheet could collapse, raising sea levels catastrophically. Any of these discoveries would explain the classification. They would explain the treaty. They would explain why certain areas remain off limits. And they would explain Byrd's warnings if you interpret them differently. He wasn't warning about aircraft from the poles. He was warning that Antarctica itself represented a strategic threat, a location that could become a flashpoint in future conflicts, a place where resources or geography could give one nation an advantage. This theory is plausible. It requires no extraordinary claims. It fits the evidence reasonably well, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the specific aircraft losses. It doesn't explain the unusual instrumental malfunctions. It doesn't explain the persistent reports from multiple expeditions over decades. So maybe the truth is even more complicated. Maybe multiple things are true. Maybe Highjump did encounter bad weather and equipment problems, and also discovered strategic resources, and also encountered something that couldn't be explained with 1940s era knowledge, and also triggered a policy decision to restrict Antarctic activity for multiple reasons. Maybe the truth is messy, layered, and impossible to summarize in a single conspiracy theory. That's often how reality works. Simple explanations are satisfying but rarely complete. The truth tends to be complicated, contradictory, and frustrating to anyone looking for clarity. So where does that leave us? We know Operation Highjump happened. We know it ended early. We know records remain classified. We know Antarctica is restricted. Beyond that, we have questions. What was encountered during the deep penetration flights? Why did Richard Byrd issue specific warnings about Antarctic threats? What's in the classified documents that still can't be released? Why does Antarctica generate so many unusual reports? The answers exist. Somewhere in a file cabinet in a government building. Somewhere in the memories of aging veterans who signed non-disclosure agreements. Somewhere beneath the ice itself. But for now, those answers remain locked away. And that might be the most frustrating part of this story. Not that we don't know the truth, but that the truth exists, documented and preserved, and we're not allowed to see it. Someone knows what happened on those Antarctic flights. Someone has read the unredacted reports. Someone decided that the information should remain secret for over 70 years. Why? What could possibly still be sensitive about a mission conducted in 1947, using technology that's completely obsolete in a geopolitical context that no longer exists? Unless the discovery is still relevant. Unless what was found in Antarctica is still there. Unless the reason for secrecy in 1947 is still the reason for secrecy today. That's the implication we're left with, that whatever Operation Highjump encountered is not historical, it's current, and that's either very exciting or very concerning, depending on what you believe is down there. Closing. The continent that keeps its secrets. Operation Highjump remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the post-war era. The largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted ended abruptly after less than 2 months. Aircraft were lost under circumstances that were never fully explained. The mission commander issued warnings about threats from the polar regions that made no sense in context. Records remain classified 75 years later, and the entire continent where it happened was placed under an international treaty that restricts military activity and limits access. These are facts, not speculation, not conspiracy theory. Facts that anyone can verify through official records, historical documents, and treaty archives. The question is what those facts mean. Was Operation Highjump a failed training exercise that ended due to predictable challenges? Was it a military mission to eliminate German holdouts operating with advanced technology? Was it humanity's first modern encounter with non-human intelligence? Or was it something else entirely? Something that doesn't fit into our existing categories? Something that remains classified because it challenges assumptions about our world? We may never know with certainty. The people who are there are gone. The documents remain sealed. The continent keeps its secrets. But the questions endure. And every so often new information surfaces, a declassified document, a deathbed confession, a research team finding something unexpected. Each new piece of information changes the picture slightly, sometimes supporting the conventional narrative, sometimes raising new questions. Antarctica is not done revealing its secrets. There's still more to discover, more to understand, and maybe, someday, the full truth about Operation Highjump will be revealed. The classified files will be opened. The real story will be told. Until then, all we have are the facts, the theories, and the uncomfortable feeling that we're not being told everything. The ice is melting. Climate change is revealing what was buried. Satellite technology is penetrating deeper. New expeditions are exploring previously inaccessible regions. What will they find? Will it confirm the conventional story? Or will it reveal something that changes everything we thought we knew? The answers are coming. Slowly. Glacially, you might say. But they're coming. And when they arrive, we'll finally know what happened during those 58 days in 1947, when the largest Antarctic expedition in history encountered something that made it turn around and flee north. Something that Richard Byrd tried to warn us about. Something that still lies beneath the ice, waiting. What if the greatest secret on Earth wasn't hidden among the stars, but buried beneath our feet for billions of years? What if we never discovered it? We just accidentally woke it up? Before we dive into today's story, I want to give a massive thank you to Jeff Anon and so many others who suggested this incredible premise. Your ideas keep this channel alive, and I'm constantly blown away by your creativity. If you have story ideas you'd like to see brought to life, drop them in the comments below. Now, let's descend into the zone of silence and uncover what should have stayed buried. Part 1. The Fall, July 11, 1970. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Voss learned that truth the hard way as his boots hit the scorched earth of northern Mexico, 50 miles south of the Texas border. The air shimmered with heat, warping the horizon into a liquid mirage. Around him, the Mapami Desert stretched in every direction. Endless, hostile, and utterly silent. Too silent. "Colonel, we've got the coordinates locked," said Sergeant Hayes, squinting at a handheld GPS unit that looked absurdly modern against the ancient landscape. 2 clicks northwest. But sir, the locals are already talking. Word travels fast out here. Voss nodded, adjusting the brim of his cap against the brutal sun. They'd landed 3 helicopters 20 minutes ago, 2 Hueys and a Chinook, ostensibly for a routine recovery operation after an Athena RTV missile went off course during a test launch from Green River, Utah. The official story was clean: malfunction, trajectory error, harmless debris scattered across uninhabited desert. The truth was considerably more complicated. "Get the perimeter established," Voss ordered. "No locals inside 500 meters. Tell them it's radiation protocol. And Hayes? Sir? Make sure the science team stays close. Whatever we're pulling out of that crater, I want it documented, catalogued, and on a transport back to Los Alamos before sunset. Hayes saluted and jogged toward the waiting convoy. Voss turned his attention to the plume of dark smoke rising from the northwest, the impact site. According to telemetry, the Athena missile had carried standard test payloads, inert warheads, atmospheric sensors, nothing exotic. But 3 separate tracking stations had registered an anomaly in the final 30 seconds before impact. A second object. Something had been travelling alongside the missile, matching its trajectory with impossible precision, before both slammed into the desert floor at terminal velocity. Voss had read the classified brief twice during the flight from Kirtland Air Force Base. He still didn't believe it. Satellites didn't just appear out of nowhere, and they certainly didn't manoeuvre without propulsion signatures. 20 minutes later, he stood at the edge of the crater. It was wrong. Craters from missile impacts followed predictable patterns. Circular depressions, radial debris fields, scorched earth in concentric rings. This crater looked like something had been extracted from the ground rather than driven into it. The walls were smooth, almost glassy, with a faint iridescence that reminded Voss of oil on water. At the centre lay twisted fragments of the Athena missile. Recognisable alloy panels, shattered guidance systems, a crumpled fuel tank, and something else. "Jesus Christ!" whispered Lieutenant Fisher, the team's metallurgist. He knelt beside a piece of debris that didn't belong. It was roughly the size of a car door, curved like a section of hull, but the metal was unlike anything Voss had seen. Smooth as polished obsidian, dark grey, with threads of crystalline material running through it like veins. Where sunlight struck the surface, faint geometric patterns seemed to pulse just beneath. Fisher reached out with a gloved hand. "Don't touch it!" Voss snapped. "Sir, I'm just... Don't touch it." Fisher pulled back. They all heard it then, a sound so low it was more felt than heard, a subsonic hum that resonated in their chests and made their teeth ache. 18 cycles per second, Voss would learn later. The exact frequency that triggers primal fear in human neurology. "Get the containment team down here now," Voss said quietly, "and somebody find me the Mexican liaison. We're going to need official cooperation to keep this quiet." That liaison turned out to be Arturo Salazar, a geophysicist from the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León. He arrived 3 hours later in a battered Land Cruiser, accompanied by 2 graduate students and an expression of barely concealed irritation. "Colonel Voss?" Salazar extended a hand. He was in his late 40s, lean and weathered, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I was told this was a routine recovery." "The crater suggests otherwise." Voss gestured toward the site. "We're securing hazardous materials. Standard protocol?" "Standard protocol involves the International Atomic Energy Agency and transparent communication with host nations," Salazar replied, his English crisp and unaccented. "What I see here is an American military operation on Mexican soil with no oversight and no explanation." "You'll have your explanation once we understand what we're dealing with." "Then let me help you understand." Salazar shouldered past Voss and descended into the crater before anyone could stop him. He knelt beside the strange metallic debris, studying it with the focused intensity of a man who'd spent his career reading secrets from rock and soil. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. "This isn't from your missile," he said finally. "What makes you say that?" Salazar pointed to the crystalline veins threading through the metal. "See these structures? They're not manufactured. They're grown. Dendritic formations consistent with slow crystallization over geological timescales. And the base metal," he leaned closer, "nickel-iron matrix, but the grain structure is wrong. Too regular. Too perfect." "Meaning?" "Meaning this is either the most sophisticated manufacturing process ever developed, or it's not manufactured at all." Salazar looked up at Voss. "Where did your missile actually come from, Colonel?" "Utah." "No, I mean what was it carrying?" Voss hesitated. The brief had been explicit. Total information security. But standing in that impossible crater, Watching the Mexican scientist piece together conclusions that matched his own worst suspicions, he made a calculation. According to radar, nothing, Voss admitted, but according to 3 separate tracking stations, something was travelling in formation with the Athena for the last 30 seconds of flight. Salazar stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees. Then you've made a very significant discovery, Colonel. And if you're smart, you'll let me help you understand it before someone else does. They worked through the afternoon, carefully extracting fragments of the anomalous debris. Each piece hummed with that same subsonic frequency, and each piece displayed properties that violated basic materials science. The metal was room temperature despite sitting in direct desert sun. It was non-magnetic, yet compasses spun wildly within 10 metres, and when Fisher finally ran a spectrographic analysis, his hands trembled as he showed Voss the results. Sir, the isotope ratios don't match anything in our database. Not Russian, not Chinese, not even theoretical experimental alloys. So where did it come from? Fisher met his eyes. I don't know. But Colonel, the decay signatures suggest an age of at least 3 billion years. The words hung in the superheated air. That's impossible, Voss said automatically. Yes, sir, it is. By sunset, they'd loaded 17 fragments onto the Chinook, each piece secured in lead-lined cases despite showing no radioactivity. Voss posted armed guards around the perimeter and ordered the crater filled and graded by morning. Official story: recovered missile components, minor fuel contamination, area cleared. But Arturo Salazar had already pocketed a small fragment, no larger than his thumb, while Voss's team focused on the larger pieces. He'd seen the fear in the Colonel's eyes, heard the tremor in Fisher's voice. Whatever this was, the Americans would classify it, bury it, and deny it ever existed. Salazar was a scientist. He believed in evidence. 2 days later, he delivered the fragment to a colleague at the Instituto Tecnológico in Monterrey with a simple request: full isotopic analysis, crystallographic structure, and complete discretion. The results came back on July 19, 1970. Composition: nickel-iron lattice with embedded crystalline silicon structures. Radiometric dating: 3.2 billion years, plus or minus 50 million. Crystalline symmetry: unknown. Not hexagonal, not cubic. Something else, something impossible. The lab technician who processed the sample noted one final detail in her report. When exposed to electromagnetic fields, the crystalline structures appeared to grow, extending microscopic filaments through the surrounding metal like roots seeking soil. On July 21st, the Monterrey laboratory suffered a catastrophic electrical fire. The building was a total loss. All samples and records were destroyed. On July 23rd, Arturo Salazar boarded a small commercial flight from Monterrey to Durango. The plane never arrived. Official cause: engine failure over mountainous terrain. No survivors. Wreckage recovered after a 3-day search showed clear signs of mechanical failure, a fractured fuel line, possibly due to improper maintenance. Colonel Voss received the news while reviewing preliminary reports at Los Alamos. He read the accident summary twice, then locked it in his safe alongside the growing file labelled Project Echo Dust. He didn't believe in coincidences, not anymore. Part 2. The Pattern. April 2024. Mara Delaney discovered the impossible on a Tuesday afternoon, buried in a dataset that should have been routine. She'd been at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena for 6 years, specialising in atmospheric particulate analysis, the unglamorous work of studying dust, specifically the microscopic debris that rained down from space every day, micrometeorites, ablated satellite fragments, cosmic dust from the solar system's formation. Most of it burned up in the upper atmosphere. The rest settled slowly to Earth, where high-altitude balloons collected samples for researchers like Mara to analyse. It was meticulous work. It required patience, precision, and a tolerance for tedium that bordered on pathological. Mara excelled at it. She was processing sample cluster 014C, collected by a weather balloon over northern Mexico in March. when the mass spectrometer results stopped making sense. "That can't be right," she muttered, leaning closer to her monitor. The isotope ratios were completely anomalous, not just unusual, fundamentally wrong. Nickel-iron signature matched carbonaceous chondrites, ancient meteorites from the solar system's formation, but the crystalline structures were far too complex, too ordered. She ran the analysis again, same results. A third time, same results. Mara pulled up NASA's open-source meteorite database and ran a comparison algorithm. No matches. She expanded the search to include university collections, private research institutes, and international databases. Still nothing. She sat back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. It was past 7 in the evening, and the lab was empty except for the hum of refrigeration units and the occasional ping of automated instruments. Outside her window, the lights of Pasadena glittered against the darkening San Gabriel Mountains. On impulse, she accessed the restricted archive, a classified collection of samples and data sets that required special clearance. She technically had access, inherited from a previous project studying satellite re-entry debris, though she rarely used it. The database was massive, poorly organised, and mostly contained decades-old Cold War military data that nobody had bothered to declassify. She entered the isotope ratios from sample 014C and hit search. One result. The file name made her pause. Echo Dust. Origin. 1970. Athena Retrieval Zone. Access restricted per Department of Defense Directive 1547. Mara clicked it. Access denied. Authorization required. She tried her credentials. Nothing. She tried her supervisor's credentials, which she technically wasn't supposed to have. Nothing. She tried the lab director's credentials, which she definitely wasn't supposed to have. The file opened. What she found inside would change everything. The document was a scanned report typed on an actual typewriter, dated September 14th, 1970. The classification header read, Top Secret, Just Gel, Special Access Required, Project Echo Dust, Summary of Preliminary Analysis. Subject, Debris recovered from Mapimi impact site, 11th July 1970. Recovered materials consist of 17 distinct fragments, ranging from 0.3 kilograms to 47.2 kilograms. All fragments display consistent composition and structural properties inconsistent with known terrestrial or meteoritic origins. Key findings: 1. Composition, nickel-iron matrix, 73% nickel, 24% iron, 3% unknown crystalline structures. 2. Age. Radiometric dating indicates formation 3.2 plus or minus 0.05 billion years before present. 3. Structure. Embedded crystalline formations display non-natural geometric symmetry. Preliminary crystallography suggests organised growth patterns inconsistent with inorganic processes. 4. Electromagnetic properties. All fragments emit low-frequency electromagnetic radiation in VLF range, 18 Hz baseline with periodic modulation. Frequency correlates with ambient geomagnetic field strength. 5. Anomalous behaviour. When subjected to varying electromagnetic fields, crystalline structures demonstrate apparent growth. Rate of growth, approximately 0.03 mm per hour under laboratory conditions. Growth ceases when EM field is removed. Recommendation: continue analysis under Level 4 containment protocols. Minimise personnel exposure. Monitor for behavioural or psychological effects related to VLF radiation exposure. Mara read the report 3 times. Each time her hands shook a little more. Growth. The thing had grown. She scrolled through attached documents, dozens of them, spanning from 1970 to 1982. Lab reports, incident summaries, personnel evaluations. Each one added another layer of impossibility. In March 1971, researchers noted that the fragments appeared to communicate with each other. When separated by more than 50 meters, they fell silent. When brought together, the 18 Hz frequency strengthened and developed complex modulation patterns. In August 1972, a technician reported hearing voices near the containment chamber. Not audible sounds, but sensations of words just below the threshold of consciousness. Psychological evaluation, no evidence of mental illness. Recommendation, reduce exposure time. In February 1973, 2 senior researchers committed suicide within a week of each other. No suicide notes, no warning signs. Both had been working directly with the largest fragment. Project Echo Dust was terminated on March 15th, 1973. All materials were transferred to secure storage location designated Site 77. All personnel were reassigned. All documentation was reclassified under Atomic Energy Commission oversight and buried in the archives. The final document in the file was a handwritten memo, barely legible. These fragments are not debris from a satellite or weapon. They're seeds. Whatever they're part of, it's still out there. Still growing. And now it knows we found it. Recommend immediate termination of all research and permanent isolation of samples. Ellis Hawthorne, Senior Analyst. Mara closed the file and stared at her monitor. Her mouth was dry. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought about sample 014-C, collected 54 years after the original fragments. Same isotope signature. Same crystalline structures. The thing was still out there, still spreading. She needed more data. Over the next week, Mara worked in secret, using access credentials she'd borrowed, stolen, if she was being honest, from colleagues. She pulled atmospheric sample data from every collection site within 1,000 kilometres of the Mapimi Desert. 30 years of data, hundreds of samples. And she found the pattern. Every sample collected within 500 kilometres of the Zone of Silence, the local name for the Mapimi impact region, showed trace amounts of the anomalous material. Not much, just a few particles per cubic metre of air. But enough to confirm that whatever had crashed in 1970 hadn't stayed buried. It was in the dust, in the air. Microscopic fragments carried on the wind, settling across northern Mexico and southern Texas. Mara cross-referenced the data with global geomagnetic records from NOAA. Whenever a magnetic storm struck, solar flares, coronal mass ejections, anything that disrupted Earth's magnetic field, the particulate concentration spiked, as if the material was responding to the magnetic disruption, or being activated by it. She found something else too, something that made her skin crawl. The Zone of Silence had a twin, actually several twins. She plotted every major electromagnetic anomaly on Earth, regions where compasses misbehaved, where radio signals failed, where the magnetic field displayed inexplicable variations, the Bermuda Triangle, the Devil's Sea off Japan, the Sargasso Sea, a region in southern Africa called the Mozambique Channel. And when she overlaid them on a map, they formed a pattern. Not random, not natural, geometric, symmetrical, deliberate, a global network. Mara sat alone in the empty lab at 3 a.m, staring at the map on her screen. The implications crashed over her like a wave. Whatever had crashed in 1970 wasn't an isolated event. It was part of something larger, something ancient, something that had been here long before humans, buried deep in the Earth's crust, dormant for billions of years. And 54 years ago, a missile from Utah had accidentally woken it up. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Stop looking into echo dust. This is your only warning." Mara's hands went cold. She looked around the empty lab, suddenly aware of how isolated she was. The building was silent except for the hum of machinery. The windows reflected only darkness. She shut down her computer, grabbed her bag and left, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Part 3. The Missing Experiment, 1971 to 1982. Mara spent the next 3 days at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., digging through declassified documents from the Atomic Energy Commission. Most of it was useless. Dry bureaucratic records of budget allocations, personnel transfers, safety inspections. But buried among the mundane paperwork, she found fragments of Project Echo Dust. Not the full story, just pieces, enough to reconstruct what had happened. After the 1970 crash, the recovered fragments had been transported to Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. A joint US-Mexican research team was assembled under the leadership of Ellis Hawthorne, a materials scientist with clearance for nuclear weapons research. The official cover story, Analysis of Ablated Satellite Debris to Improve Re-entry Shield Technology. The real work was far stranger. Hawthorne's team discovered that the fragments weren't passive objects, they were reactive. When exposed to electromagnetic fields, particularly low-frequency fields in the VLF range, the crystalline structures began to grow, extending microscopic filaments through the surrounding metal like neural networks. The growth was slow but relentless. Under laboratory conditions, a single fragment could double in size over 6 months, and the growth was purposeful. When separated, fragments would orient their growth toward each other, as if seeking connection. When brought together, they would fuse seamlessly, their crystalline structures interweaving until the boundary between them disappeared. Hawthorne theorized that the fragments were part of a larger structure, a distributed network designed to self-assemble, given sufficient time and energy. But the most disturbing discovery came from the VLF monitoring. The fragments emitted a constant low-frequency hum at 18 Hz, a frequency known to induce fear, anxiety and disorientation in humans. But the signal wasn't constant, it modulated. It changed patterns based on external stimuli, magnetic field fluctuations, seismic activity, even the presence of nearby electronic equipment. One researcher described it as almost conversational. In August 1972, Hawthorne authorized an experiment. They isolated the largest fragment in a shielded chamber and exposed it to a series of electromagnetic pulses designed to mimic natural geomagnetic fluctuations. The fragment responded, not just with growth, but with what could only be described as communication. The VLF signal developed complex patterns, rhythmic pulses that repeated in sequences, varied in duration, displayed what appeared to be syntactic structure. Hawthorne recorded over 40 hours of signal data before the experiment was terminated. He never published the results. Mara found his notes in a misfiled folder labelled Equipment Calibration Tests 1972. They were handwritten, barely legible, and increasingly frantic. August 14th. The signal patterns are not random. Statistical analysis confirms non-random distribution of pulse sequences. Probability of natural occurrence, less than 0.00001%. August 19th. We've identified repeating sequences that correspond to geomagnetic variations. It's tracking the Earth's magnetic field in real time. How? August 23rd. 2 technicians reported auditory hallucinations near the containment chamber. Both describe hearing whispers just below conscious perception. Psychological eval shows no prior history of mental illness. August 29th. I'm hearing them too, not words exactly, more like impressions, concepts. It's trying to communicate. September 3rd. I understand now. It's not trying to communicate with us. It's trying to communicate to something else. The fragments aren't debris, they're transmitters. The notes ended there. 3 weeks later, the lab reported its first unexplained incident. A catastrophic power failure that knocked out all systems for 47 minutes. When power was restored, the containment chamber was empty. Not broken open, not damaged, just empty. The fragment was found 2 days later, 17 metres away, in a sub-basement that had been sealed since the 1950s. There was no way for it to have gotten there. The containment doors had never been opened. The seals were intact. It had simply moved. Hawthorne's final memo, dated March 12th, 1973, was a single sentence. We need to stop. Now. Project Echo Dust was terminated 3 days later, but Mara found one more document. A transfer order dated April 1973, authorizing the movement of all recovered materials to Site 77, Nevada Test Range. She'd never heard of Site 77. It didn't appear in any official documentation, not in the Atomic Energy Commission records, not in Department of Defense facility listings, not anywhere. As far as the official record was concerned, Site 77 didn't exist. which meant the fragments had been buried so deep, so completely, that even the people who'd buried them wanted to forget where. Mara flew back to Pasadena and returned to her lab. She had a theory now, a terrifying, impossible theory that explained everything. She just needed one more piece of proof. Part 4. The signal returns. The proof came from NOAA. Mara spent an entire weekend downloading geomagnetic field data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Global Sensor Network. The data went back decades. Continuous monitoring of Earth's magnetic field from hundreds of stations worldwide. She focused on the zone of silence and surrounding regions, and she found it. A signal. Faint, irregular, but undeniably present. Every time a geomagnetic storm struck, solar flares, coronal mass ejections, anything that disturbed Earth's magnetic field, the zone of silence emitted a pulse of VLF radiation, the same 18 Hz frequency documented in 1970. But there was more. The signal had a structure. Mara fed it through pattern recognition algorithms designed to detect artificial signals in radio astronomy data. The same tools SETI used to search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The results came back positive. Non-random, intentional, repeating, and the signal was growing stronger. In 1975, the pulses occurred only during major geomagnetic storms, perhaps once or twice a year. By 1990, they occurred monthly. By 2010, weekly. Now in 2024, they occurred daily. Whatever was buried beneath the zone of silence was waking up. Mara plotted the signal sources on a map. The zone of silence was the epicenter, but secondary signals appeared from the other electromagnetic anomaly zones she'd identified. The Bermuda Triangle, the Devil's Sea, the Mozambique Channel. They were all active now, all synchronized. She zoomed in on the zone of silence and overlaid satellite imagery. The desert looked unchanged, barren, empty, lifeless. But when she applied infrared filtering, something emerged. A pattern in the sand, geometric, hexagonal, extending for hundreds of meters beneath the surface. Not a pattern in the sand, a pattern of the sand. The ground itself had been reorganized into crystalline structures too large to see from the ground, visible only from space, like the fragments from 1970, scaled up to geological proportions. Mara's hands shook as she zoomed closer. At the center of the pattern, precisely where the 1970 crash occurred, the structure was denser, darker, as if the material had concentrated there, drawing itself together, growing. She pulled radio telescope data from the Very Large Array in New Mexico. The VLA monitored radio emissions across a broad spectrum, including the VLF range where the echo dust signal appeared. And there it was, a transmission, faint but clear, originating from the zone of silence. Not continuous, it pulsed in bursts lasting exactly 1.7 seconds, repeated every 6 minutes and 43 seconds. Mara isolated the signal and ran it through a binary decoder. The output made her stomach drop. 010110110101010101001. She converted it to ASCII. Where? The word appeared on her screen in stark black letters. Where? Not a statement. A question. Something was asking. Mara sat in her silent apartment staring at her laptop screen until dawn. Outside, Los Angeles stirred to life. Traffic, voices, the mundane rhythm of a city waking. Inside, she grappled with a truth that made the world feel suddenly fragile. 54 years ago, humanity had accidentally disturbed something ancient and vast. Something that predated civilization, predated humanity, possibly predated life itself on Earth. It had been dormant for billions of years, buried deep in the crust, waiting. And now it was waking up. Now it was asking questions. Mara knew what she had to do. She had to go to the zone of silence herself. Part 5. The Descent. The zone of silence sits in the Mapimi Biosphere Reserve, a protected area of Chihuahuan Desert in northern Mexico. It's one of the most remote regions in North America, hours from the nearest city, accessible only by rough dirt roads that disappear in sandstorms. Locals call it the Zona del Silencio because radio signals fail there, compasses spin, electronic equipment malfunctions. The Mexican government officially attributes this to natural magnetic anomalies. Unofficially, they discourage visits. Mara arrived on a Thursday morning in early May, driving a rented Toyota 4Runner loaded with scientific equipment she'd purchased with her own credit cards. She'd taken emergency leave from JPL, citing a family crisis. She didn't tell her supervisor where she was really going. The drive from Torreon took 6 hours across increasingly rough terrain. The highway gave way to paved rural roads, then gravel, then dirt tracks barely visible through desert scrub. GPS stopped working 50 kilometres out. Mara navigated by paper maps and a compass that spun lazily, useless. She'd studied satellite imagery for days, memorising landmarks. A distinctive rock formation shaped like a broken tooth, a dry riverbed that carved through red stone, a cluster of weathered buildings that might have been a ranch decades ago. She found the crash site by following the geometry visible only from space. The desert looked empty at ground level, just sand, rock, and thorny vegetation stretching to the horizon under a merciless sun. But Mara had printed satellite images with infrared overlays, and she'd marked the centre point with GPS coordinates that she'd recorded before the signals failed. She parked the 4Runner, grabbed her equipment and hiked. The temperature was 42 degrees Celsius. The air shimmered. Nothing moved except dust devils that twisted across the flats like ghosts. And then the sound started. At first Mara thought it was her imagination, a subsonic vibration more felt than heard, but as she approached the coordinates it grew stronger. A hum, a pulse, 18 cycles per second, just like the reports from 1970. It resonated in her chest, made her teeth ache, made her afraid. She stopped at the crest of a low ridge and looked down. The ground was wrong, not obviously wrong, but wrong in subtle ways that made her brain struggle to process what she was seeing. The sand had formed patterns, concentric circles radiating from a central depression, too regular to be natural. The rocks were oriented in parallel lines as if organised by something with purpose, and at the centre the sand was moving, not blowing in the wind, moving, shifting, reorganising itself grain by grain into geometric structures that caught the light and glinted like metal. Mara descended into the depression, her equipment rattling in her backpack. She carried a Geiger counter, no radiation, a magnetometer, wildly fluctuating readings, and a portable mass spectrometer, completely non-functional. At the centre of the pattern she knelt and pressed her gloved hand into the sand. It was warm, and it was humming. She dug, not deep, just 30 centimetres down, brushing sand away with careful strokes. And there, just beneath the surface, she found it. Metal, not a fragment, not a piece, a structure. Smooth, grey, crystalline veins running through darker substrate. It extended beyond what she could see, disappearing under the surrounding desert. She cleared more sand, working faster now, and the structure emerged. Hexagonal patterns, each cell roughly 50 centimetres across, fitted together with impossible precision. It wasn't buried, it was integrated, fused into the bedrock, growing through the stone like roots through soil. Mara pulled out her phone, no signal but the camera still worked, and started documenting. She photographed the structure from every angle, noting the geometric precision, the crystalline growth patterns, the faint iridescence where sunlight struck the surface. And then her phone died. Not the battery, the entire device simply stopped working. She looked at her watch. It had stopped too. The hands frozen at 3:47. The magnetometer in her pack started beeping frantically, and the humming grew louder. Mara stood, backing away from the exposed structure. The sand around her feet was moving now, grains organising themselves into lines that pointed toward the centre, toward her. She heard it then, not with her ears but inside her head. A sensation of presence, of attention focused on her like a spotlight. It knew she was there. She ran. Mara made it back to the Forerunner, threw her equipment in the back, and drove. She didn't stop until she reached Torreon 3 hours later, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. In her hotel room, she dumped the memory card from her camera and opened the files on her laptop. Most of them were corrupted, but 3 survived. 3 images showing the hexagonal structure emerging from the sand, crystalline veins glinting in afternoon sun, impossibly precise geometric patterns extending beyond the frame. Evidence, proof that something was down there, something vast, something ancient, something alive. Mara uploaded the images to a secure cloud server, then copied them to 3 USB drives. She mailed one to her brother in Oregon, one to a colleague in Germany, and kept the 3rd. Then she called NASA. Part 6. The Revelation. Delaney, what the hell were you thinking? James Ruiz, her supervisor at JPL, looked more tired than angry. They sat in his office at 8 in the morning, 2 days after Mara's return from Mexico. She'd been summoned by email. My office, Monday, 8 a.m, mandatory. I was following the data, Mara said. You were trespassing in a foreign country on unauthorized leave, investigating classified material that you accessed illegally. Ruiz leaned back in his chair. Do you understand the position you've put this lab in? Did you look at the images I sent? I looked. I also got a call from the Defense Department asking why one of my scientists was digging around in restricted archives. He pulled a folder from his desk drawer and slid it across. This is your termination paperwork. I'm supposed to have you sign it today. Mara's stomach dropped. James dash. I'm not going to do that. Not yet. Ruiz stood and walked to his window looking out over the JPL campus. But you need to stop. Whatever you think you found, it's above our pay grade. Way above. It's not above anyone's pay grade, Mara said quietly. It's bigger than security clearances and classified files. Something is buried under that desert, and it's been growing for 50 years. Maybe longer. Maybe billions of years. And we accidentally woke it up. Ruiz turned. You sound paranoid. I sound right. He studied her for a long moment. What do you want me to do, Mara? Let me present my findings, internally, just to the atmospheric science team. If they think I'm crazy, I'll resign. But if they see what I see, then what? We publish. We go public? Ruiz shook his head. That's not how this works. If what you found is real, there are protocols, channels, ways of handling this that don't involve rogue scientists and international incidents. The protocols failed 50 years ago, Mara said. They found this thing in 1970, studied it, realised it was dangerous, and buried it. And now it's waking up. The signal is getting stronger every day. Ruiz was silent for a long time. Finally he sighed. I'll give you 1 week. Compile everything you have. Every data point, every analysis, every image. Make it bulletproof. Then we'll decide together what to do with it. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. And Mara. No more trips to Mexico. She nodded, but they both knew she was lying. That night Mara couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table reviewing data until her eyes burned. The signal pattern from the zone of silence. The growth rate of the atmospheric particulates. The geographic distribution of electromagnetic anomalies. And then she saw it. The pattern she'd been missing. She pulled up a global map and plotted every major electromagnetic anomaly on Earth. Not just the obvious ones, the Bermuda Triangle, the Devil's Sea, the Zone of Silence, but every location where compasses misbehaved, where radio signals failed, where the magnetic field showed unexplained variations. 47 locations worldwide. When she connected them, they formed a network, a geometric lattice that covered the entire planet, with nodes positioned at mathematically precise intervals. The same hexagonal structure she'd found in the Mexican desert, scaled up to planetary size. Earth wasn't just hosting these structures. Earth was the structure, the rocks, the iron core, the magnetic field itself. All of it, billions of years of geological history, might have been influenced, shaped, grown by this ancient metallic organism that had seeded itself in the planet's crust before life even began. Humanity hadn't evolved on Earth. Humanity had evolved inside something else. Mara's phone rang, making her jump. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "Hello? Mara Delaney?" A woman's voice, calm and professional. "Who is this?" "My name is Dr. Carmen Vasquez. I worked with Arturo Salazar in 1970. I need to meet with you. Tonight. It's urgent." Mara's pulse quickened. Salazar died in a plane crash. That's what they wanted everyone to believe. "Meet me at the Griffith Observatory parking lot in 1 hour. Come alone, and bring your data." The line went dead. Mara knew it was probably a trap. She went anyway. Griffith Observatory sat on the southern slope of Mount Hollywood, overlooking Los Angeles. At night, the city spread below like a circuit board, millions of lights arranged in patterns that mimicked the hexagonal networks Mara had been studying. She parked and waited. Her phone showed 11:47 p.m. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman in her late 70s, grey hair pulled back, moving with surprising agility. "Mara Delaney, you said you knew Arturo Salazar." "I was his graduate student in 1970. I was with him when he collected the fragment from the crash site." Carmen sat on the bench beside her, looking out over the city. "He didn't die in that plane crash. He went into hiding after the Monterey lab burned down. He knew they were coming for him." "Who?" "The people who've been managing this situation for 50 years. The ones who decided the world couldn't handle the truth." Carmen pulled a weathered notebook from her bag. Arturo spent the rest of his life studying that fragment. He died in 2003, but before he did, he asked me to find someone who could finish his work. Someone brave enough to look at the evidence and not look away. She handed Mara the notebook. The pages were filled with diagrams, calculations, spectroscopic analyses, and theories. Brilliant, terrifying theories about what the fragments represented. "He called it the substrate," Carmen said quietly. "A metallic organism that seeded itself in Earth's crust 4 billion years ago, before the first cells evolved. It's been dormant all this time, growing so slowly that geological processes buried it kilometers deep. But the 1970 crash, that missile impact, it was like hitting a nerve. It woke something up." "The signal," Mara whispered. "Not just a signal, a network coming online." Arturo believed the substrate has been monitoring Earth's magnetic field for billions of years, waiting for the right conditions, and now, with all our satellites, radio transmissions, power grids, we've created an electromagnetic environment that's feeding it, making it grow faster. What does it want? Carmen smiled sadly. Arturo spent 30 years trying to answer that question. He never did. But he believed the substrate isn't hostile. It's just waking up, remembering. And the signal? Where? It's not threatening us. It's asking us. Asking where it is. What happened? How much time has passed? 4 billion years, Mara said. That's how much time has passed. Yes, and now it's confused, trying to understand a world that's completely different from the one it knew. Mara looked at the notebook, at Arturo Salazar's careful handwriting documenting 50 years of secret research. What am I supposed to do with this? What Arturo couldn't. Tell the world, not through government channels or classified briefings, but directly. Show them the evidence. Let them decide how to respond. They'll never believe it. They will. Because the signal's getting stronger every day. Soon, everyone will hear it. Mara spent the next 3 days compiling everything. Salazar's research, her atmospheric data, the satellite imagery, the signal recordings. She created a comprehensive report that laid out the evidence in clear, undeniable terms. Then she uploaded it to every major scientific journal, every news organisation, every government agency she could think of. Within hours, her access to NASA systems was revoked. Within a day, federal agents appeared at her apartment, but by then it was too late. The data was out there, spreading, replicating across the internet faster than anyone could contain it. scientists around the world began confirming her findings: the electromagnetic anomalies, the atmospheric particulates, the VLF signals emanating from dozens of locations worldwide. And then, on a Thursday morning, the world didn't end, it changed. Within a week, the United Nations convened an emergency session. Scientists testified, evidence was presented. Governments that had spent 50 years hiding the truth were forced to acknowledge it. Yes, something ancient existed beneath Earth's surface. Yes, it was waking up. No, they didn't know what would happen next. Mara watched the proceedings from her apartment in Pasadena, unemployed but vindicated. Her phone rang constantly. Journalists, researchers, government officials, all wanting to talk about the substrate. She ignored most of them, but she answered when Carmen Vasquez called. "You did it," the older woman said. "Arturo would be proud. I just showed them the data. They did the rest. That's all science ever is. Showing people what's really there and trusting them to handle the truth." Mara looked at her laptop where a new email had just arrived. The subject line: Collaborative Research Initiative, Substrate Communication Project. They wanted her help. The world wanted to understand what was waking up beneath their feet. They wanted to communicate with it, learn from it, figure out how to coexist with something that had been here long before humans and would likely be here long after. It was the biggest scientific challenge in human history. And Mara Delaney, unemployed atmospheric scientist, was at the centre of it. She smiled and opened the email. "I'm in," she said. 6 months later, the first successful communication was established. Not through radio signals or electromagnetic pulses, but through something simpler: rhythm. Researchers in Mexico tapped out patterns on the exposed hexagonal structures in the zone of silence, and the substrate tapped back. It wasn't language, not yet, but it was contact, a dialogue between humanity and something impossibly ancient. A conversation that would take decades, maybe centuries, to develop into understanding. But it had begun. Mara stood in the Mapimi desert, her hand pressed against the warm metal beneath the sand, and felt the gentle hum vibrating through her palm. 18 pulses per second. The heartbeat of a world beneath the world. She thought about Arturo Salazar, who died keeping the secret safe. About Ellis Hawthorne, who'd realised too late what they'd discovered. About all the people who'd glimpsed this truth and been silenced or ignored. They'd been afraid of what would happen if the world knew, but the world had proven them wrong. Humanity hadn't panicked, hadn't collapsed. Instead, people had done what humans always did when confronted with something mysterious and vast. They'd gotten curious. They'd started asking questions. And now, slowly, carefully, they were learning to listen to the answers. Mara pulled her hand away from the metal and stood. The sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Around her, an international team of researchers worked steadily, documenting, analysing, communicating. 54 years after a missile went off the course and crashed into the zone of silence, humanity had finally made first contact. Not with visitors from the stars, but with something even more profound. The ancient intelligence woven into the very fabric of the world they called home. The Earth had always been alive. They were just finally learning to hear it speak. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a thank you to Don Welsh for this incredible video suggestion. The Tetris conspiracy is one of those rabbit holes that just keeps getting deeper the more you dig. If you have ideas for future videos, please drop them in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us awake at night, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Trust me, after tonight's story you might need something to help you sleep. Now, let me tell you about the package that changed everything, and how a simple children's game became the key to understanding one of the Cold War's most carefully buried secrets. I never thought I'd be pulled into a Cold War ghost story. My life was ordinary. A freelance researcher with a small apartment, a dying houseplant, and a Netflix subscription that got more use than my gym membership. I wrote articles about obscure historical events for online magazines that paid just enough to keep the lights on. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. But then the package arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier service I'd never heard of, Meridian Express. The driver was nervous, constantly checking his phone, and he made me sign 3 different forms before he'd hand over the manila envelope. No return address, just my name written in careful block letters across the front, Elena Vasquez, personal and confidential. Inside I found documents that shouldn't have existed. Soviet-era memos with Cyrillic letterheads, computer printouts from the 1980s, and scientific papers that looked like they'd been smuggled out of some classified archive. But it was the photograph that made my hand shake. A Polaroid, faded and slightly yellow around the edges. The image showed a group of men in thick sweaters standing around what looked like an early computer terminal. The setting was clearly academic. I could see chalkboards covered in equations in the background. But there, in the corner of the photo, was a little girl with pigtails playing with building blocks on the floor. The little girl was me, and the man kneeling beside me, showing me how to stack the coloured blocks, was someone I'd never seen before in my life. According to the handwritten note on the back of the photo, Vladimir Pokilko, Moscow Computer Center, 1987. The note at the bottom of the package explained everything and nothing at once. Eleanor, your father's work touched more lives than he ever knew. What happened to us was not an accident. The game was never just a game. You have his eyes, and more importantly, you have his mind. Be careful who you trust. The blocks are still falling. A friend. I sat in my kitchen for 20 minutes staring at that photograph. My father, Dr. Miguel Vasquez, had been a computer scientist who'd worked on early artificial intelligence research in the late 1980s. He died when I was 12, a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. But I remembered him telling me stories about his work, about trips to conferences where brilliant minds from around the world shared their discoveries. One story in particular came flooding back. He'd told me about a simple game that had captured the imagination of everyone who played it. 7 shapes, falling from the sky, fitting together like pieces of an impossible puzzle. The most beautiful thing about mathematics, he'd said, is that even chaos follows patterns. That game proves it. He'd been talking about Tetris. I'd never connected those childhood stories to the global phenomenon Tetris became. But as I looked at that photograph, as I saw myself playing with blocks while Vladimir Pokilko watched, I realised I hadn't stumbled into this mystery. I'd been born into it. The package wasn't a random delivery, it was an inheritance. And according to what I was about to discover, it was also a death sentence. The first thing I learned about Tetris was that everything I thought I knew was wrong. Most people believe the story goes like this. In 1984, a Russian programmer named Alexei Pajitnov created a simple puzzle game while working at the Moscow Academy of Sciences. The game was so addictive that it spread through the Soviet Union like wildfire, eventually making its way to the West, where it became one of the most successful video games of all time. A beautiful story of creativity triumphing over Cold War tensions, but my father's notebooks told a different story. I found them 3 days after receiving the package, hidden in a storage unit I'd inherited but never bothered to visit. Box after box of research papers, computer printouts, and handwritten journals that my father had apparently been keeping secret for years. The notebooks were written in a mixture of English and Spanish, with mathematical formulas scattered throughout like some kind of academic code. The entry that changed everything was dated October 15th, 1987. The Moscow conference was more productive than expected. Met with Pokhilko's team today. Their work on pattern recognition is fascinating but disturbing. The game they've developed, they call it Tetris from the Greek tetra meaning four, shows remarkable potential for cognitive conditioning. The subjects who play for extended periods exhibit measurable changes in brainwave patterns. Pokhilko believes they've accidentally created a form of technological hypnosis. The entry continued. Showed Elena the coloured blocks today while we were in Moscow. She was so young, so innocent. She didn't understand that she was playing with the building blocks of something that could reshape human consciousness. None of us did. We thought we were just studying games. We had no idea we were creating weapons. I read that passage 5 times before it sank in. My father hadn't just been a conference attendee in Moscow. He'd been part of the team that helped develop Tetris, and according to his notes, they'd discovered something that terrified them. The game was changing people's minds. The phenomenon was subtle at first. Players would report seeing the falling blocks when they closed their eyes. They'd dream about the game. They'd find themselves mentally rotating objects in daily life, trying to make them fit together like Tetris pieces. Researchers dubbed it the Tetris effect, and initially everyone thought it was harmless, just the brain's way of processing repetitive visual information. But my father's notes suggested something much more sinister. The Tetris effect wasn't just visual persistence, it was cognitive rewiring. Players were being conditioned to think in patterns, to seek order from chaos, to derive satisfaction from solving problems that had been specifically designed to trigger dopamine release. In other words, Tetris was a mind control experiment disguised as entertainment. My father's final entry about the Moscow project was dated November the 3rd, 1987. Had to leave the conference early. Pokhilko pulled me aside yesterday, said things were getting dangerous. The KGB has taken interest in our research. They don't see Tetris as a game. They see it as a tool for psychological manipulation. Military applications, civilian control. I'm bringing Elena home tomorrow. Some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue. That was the last mention of Tetris in my father's notebooks for over a decade, but I knew the story didn't end there. Because if it had, I never would have received that package. Someone wanted me to know what really happened to Tetris. More importantly, they wanted me to understand what had happened to the people who'd helped create it. And as I was about to discover, very few of those people were still alive. Robert Maxwell died on November 5th, 1991, but the circumstances of his death were so bizarre that conspiracy theorists are still debating them today. The media mogul and publisher was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near the Canary Islands, having apparently fallen overboard from his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. Some called it suicide, others suspected murder. But almost nobody connected his death to a simple puzzle game. Almost nobody. Among my father's papers, I found a folder labelled Maxwell Correspondence 1990 to 1991. Inside were photocopies of letters that revealed a side of Robert Maxwell's business empire that had never made it into the history books. Maxwell hadn't just been interested in newspapers and publishing. He'd been deeply involved in the international licensing of Soviet software, including games. The letter that caught my attention was dated March 18th, 1991. Dear Dr. Vasquez, I hope this letter finds you well. As discussed during our meeting in London, I remain very interested in the psychological applications you and your Moscow colleagues discovered. The commercial success of the game has exceeded all projections, but I believe we've only scratched the surface of its potential. The pharmaceutical applications alone could be worth billions. Please reconsider your decision to withdraw from the project. Some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. R. Maxwell. Pharmaceutical applications? I read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what Maxwell could have meant. Then I found my father's reply, dated March 25th, 1991. Robert, I've made my position clear. The research we conducted in Moscow was preliminary and potentially dangerous. The cognitive effects we observed in test subjects were concerning enough to warrant ceasing all experiments. I will not be party to any attempt to weaponize this technology, regardless of the financial incentives involved. Please do not contact me about this matter again. Miguel Vasquez. But Maxwell did contact him again. The folder contained 7 more letters, each one increasingly desperate, increasingly threatening. Maxwell's final letter, dated October the 30th, 1991, just 6 days before his death, was the most chilling. Miguel, you're making a mistake that will cost both of us dearly. The people I represent are not patient. They invested heavily in this project based on the promise of the Moscow research. If you continue to refuse cooperation, I cannot guarantee your safety or that of your family. This is not a threat. It's a warning. There are forces at work here that neither of us fully understands. R.M. 6 days later, Robert Maxwell was dead. The official investigation concluded that Maxwell had either committed suicide or suffered an accidental fall from his yacht. But investigators found several unusual details that never made it into the public record. Maxwell's personal safe had been emptied before his death, and several £1 million had been transferred from his accounts to shell companies in Eastern Europe. More importantly, his yacht's security cameras had been mysteriously disabled during the exact time frame of his disappearance. I might have dismissed these coincidences if I hadn't found one more document in my father's files, a newspaper clipping from the London Times, dated November the 7th, 1991. Someone had highlighted a single paragraph buried deep in the article about Maxwell's death. Among Maxwell's personal effects recovered from the yacht were several computer disks labelled Project Tetris, and a notebook containing what appeared to be psychological research notes. These items had been turned over to British intelligence for investigation. Project Tetris. My father had never mentioned any project by that name, but the connection was obvious. Maxwell had been trying to commercialise the psychological effects that the Moscow team had discovered. He'd been working with people who had enough power and influence to make problems disappear permanently. And when Maxwell tried to back out, or perhaps demanded too much money, those same people had made him disappear too. The question that kept me awake at night was simple. If they were willing to kill Robert Maxwell, one of the most powerful media moguls in the world, what would they do to the researchers who'd actually created the technology? I was about to find out. Vladimir Pokhilko was supposed to be a success story. The co-creator of Tetris had emigrated to the United States in the 1990s and founded his own software company in Silicon Valley. He had the American dream within his grasp. A beautiful house in Palo Alto, a loving wife, 2 children, and the promise of financial success from his work on one of the world's most popular games. On September 22nd, 1998, police found Vladimir Pokhilko, his wife Elena, and their 12-year-old son Peter dead in their home. The official report concluded that Pokhilko had murdered his family before taking his own life, driven to madness by financial pressures and the stress of a failing business. But the evidence never quite added up. Among the documents in the package I'd received was a police report that had supposedly been sealed. The details painted a picture that was much more complex and disturbing than the official story suggested. Pokhilko had been found with multiple stab wounds, which was unusual for a suicide. His wife and son showed signs of struggle, but there was no evidence that Pokhilko had been physically capable of overpowering both of them. Most importantly, neighbours reported seeing unfamiliar cars in the area during the days leading up to the deaths. But it was the contents of Pokhilko's home office that revealed the truth. According to the police inventory, investigators found dozens of pages of handwritten notes in Russian, all apparently burned in the fireplace except for fragments that had escaped the flames. The few readable pieces contained references to psychological experiments, Moscow protocols, and behavioural modification through repetitive stimulus. One fragment preserved in the police file was particularly chilling. The game was never the goal. The game was the delivery mechanism. We created the perfect Trojan horse, entertainment that reprograms the mind through voluntary participation. But they want to weaponize it, to use it for purposes we never intended. I've tried to stop them, but... The note ended there, torn and partially burned. The package I'd received contained something the police had never seen. a recording of Vladimir Pokhilko's last phone call, made just hours before his death. The audio quality was poor, full of static and background noise, but Pokhilko's voice was unmistakable. He was speaking to someone who wasn't responding, perhaps leaving a voicemail message. If you're listening to this, it means they've found me. I've tried to warn everyone who was part of the original research, but most of them are already gone. Maxwell was just the beginning. They're systematically eliminating everyone who knows the truth about what we created. Static filled the recording for several seconds before Pokhilko's voice returned, more urgent now. The game is still active, still spreading, still changing minds on a global scale. But that was never the plan. We thought we were creating entertainment. We didn't know we were creating a weapon, and now that weapon is being used against millions of people without their knowledge or consent. Another pause, then Pokhilko's voice became almost whispered. Miguel Vasquez was smart to leave when he did. He saw where this was heading before the rest of us. If they come for me, tell him. Tell him the devil is in the code. The patterns aren't random. They never were. Each level, each piece placement, each reward mechanism, it's all designed to create specific neurological responses. We built a machine that learns how to manipulate human behaviour, and now we've lost control of it. The recording ended abruptly, cut off mid-sentence. I listened to that message a dozen times, and each time I felt a chill run down my spine. Vladimir Pokhilko hadn't killed his family and himself. He'd been silenced because he was trying to expose the truth about Tetris. And in his final moments, he'd specifically mentioned my father's name. My father had known this was coming. That's why he'd left the Moscow project. That's why he'd hidden his research. And that's why he'd never told me the truth about what he'd been involved in. But someone had decided it was time for me to know. The question was, who had sent me the package and why were they willing to risk their life to get this information to me? The human brain is remarkably adaptable. Give it a repetitive task and it will quickly develop neural pathways to handle that task more efficiently. Show it patterns and it will learn to recognize and predict those patterns. This neuroplasticity is usually considered a good thing. It's how we learn languages, develop skills, and adapt to new environments. But my father's research had discovered that this adaptability could be exploited. The notebook I'd found contained detailed studies of Tetris players, conducted over several months in 1987. The results were both fascinating and terrifying. After just 2 weeks of regular play, subjects showed measurable changes in brainwave patterns. After a month, they exhibited altered sleep cycles, with REM sleep dominated by geometric patterns and spatial processing dreams. After 3 months, the changes became permanent. Most concerning was what my father called the compliance correlation. Players who spent more than an hour per day playing Tetris showed increased susceptibility to authority figures and decreased critical thinking when faced with routine tasks. They became, in his words, more comfortable with imposed order and less likely to question systematic control. The implications were staggering. Tetris wasn't just addictive in the conventional sense. It was literally rewiring players' brains to be more compliant, more accepting of external control, more willing to find satisfaction in repetitive, meaningless tasks. It was the perfect tool for social conditioning. My father's notes from October 1987 revealed the moment when he realised what they had created. Observed Eleanor playing with the coloured blocks again today. She's become obsessed with making them fit together perfectly, just like the Tetris players in our study. But when I tried to get her to stop and help with dinner, she became agitated and insisted on finishing the pattern. This is exactly the behaviour we've documented in the test subjects, an inability to abandon incomplete geometric tasks, even when more important activities require attention. The realisation hit me like a physical blow. We haven't just created a game that changes how people think. We've created a game that makes people prioritise the game over everything else in their lives, and if that principle could be applied to other activities, other systems, other forms of control... I need to get Elena away from Moscow immediately. This research needs to be buried. But the research hadn't been buried. According to the documents in the package, it had been expanded. I found copies of scientific papers published in obscure Soviet journals throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The authors were always different, but the research methodology was identical to what my father had documented. Studies on geometric pattern recognition and behavioural modification, experiments in visual stimulus conditioning and compliance enhancement, theoretical frameworks for large-scale cognitive influence through interactive media. The most chilling paper was published in 1992, 3 years after my father had left the project. The title was innocuous: Applications of Repetitive Visual Stimulus in Educational Software Design. But the content described a systematic program to embed Tetris-like elements into everything from children's learning games to employee training programs. The authors had figured out how to weaponize the Tetris effect, and they were deploying it everywhere. I started paying attention to the games my friends played, the apps on their phones, the casual entertainment they consumed during breaks at work. The patterns were everywhere once I knew how to look for them. Falling objects that needed to be arranged, repetitive tasks that provided small rewards at regular intervals, visual stimuli designed to trigger the same neurological responses that my father's team had first documented in Moscow. We weren't just playing games, we were being programmed. The most disturbing part was how voluntary it all seemed. Nobody was forcing people to play these games. In fact, people paid money for the privilege of having their minds reshaped. They carried the programming devices in their pockets, installed the conditioning software on their home computers, and spent hours each day voluntarily submitting to psychological manipulation. And they enjoyed it. My father had tried to stop this from happening, but he'd been just one researcher against a system that had recognised the incredible potential of what they'd discovered. The people behind Project Tetris hadn't just created a game, they'd created a blueprint for controlling human behaviour on a global scale. But there was one thing I still didn't understand. If the technology was so powerful and so widespread, why were the original researchers being killed? Why not just buy their silence with money and success? The answer, I realised, was simple. The researchers knew too much about how the system worked, and more importantly, they knew how to turn it off. Death has a way of following certain kinds of knowledge. The deeper I dug into the history of Tetris and its creators, the more bodies I found scattered across 3 decades. It started with the obvious cases, Robert Maxwell and Vladimir Pokilko, but the pattern extended far beyond the famous names. Dr. Alexei Gerasimov, one of the original Moscow researchers, died in a car accident in 1994. Professor Marina Volkov, who had studied the psychological effects of geometric puzzles, succumbed to a sudden illness in 1996. Viktor Briabrin, who helped program the first version of Tetris, was found dead in his apartment from an apparent gas leak in 2001. Each death had a plausible explanation. Car accidents happen, people get sick, gas leaks occur. But when I mapped out the timeline and cross-referenced it with the documents in the package, a clear pattern emerged. Everyone who had intimate knowledge of the psychological research behind Tetris was dying at a rate that defied statistical probability. The folder labelled Casualty Report contained obituaries, newspaper clippings and death certificates for 47 individuals connected to the original Moscow project or its subsequent developments. 47 people, dead over the course of 20 years, with an average age of death significantly lower than the general population. But it was the method of elimination that revealed the true sophistication of whoever was behind this. No obvious assassinations, no suspicious murders that would attract media attention, just a steady stream of accidents, illnesses and suicides that could be explained away individually but formed an unmistakable pattern when viewed collectively. My father had been scheduled to die in 1999, according to a handwritten list I found tucked into one of the folders. His name was crossed out with a note: Natural causes, heart attack 1991, no further action required. He'd escaped the systematic elimination by dying of natural causes before they could get to him. The irony was bitter. My father's weak heart had probably saved his life by ending it, before his knowledge became too dangerous to ignore. But I was still alive, and according to the documents, I'd inherited not just my father's research, but also his place on their list. The package had been sent to me by someone who signed themselves only as Deep Throat, an obvious reference to the Watergate informant. But their identity wasn't as important as their warning. Elena, By now you understand what your father was involved in. What you may not realise is that the project never ended. Tetris was just the beginning. The technology has evolved, been refined and deployed on a scale your father never could have imagined. Every social media app, every casual game, every productivity program contains elements of the original Moscow research. Humanity is being systematically conditioned for compliance, and most people don't even realise it's happening. The original researchers are being eliminated not because they might expose the project, but because they know how to reverse its effects. Your father's notebooks contain algorithms that could potentially deprogram the conditioning, but only if someone with the right knowledge could implement them. That's why they want you dead. Not for what you know, but for what you might be able to do with what you know. You have a choice to make. You can destroy the research, disappear, and hope they leave you alone. Or you can finish what your father started and try to give humanity back its free will. But understand this. Once you make that choice, there's no going back. They will hunt you to the ends of the earth rather than risk losing control of the system they've spent decades building. The letter ended with coordinates, a location in the Nevada desert where, supposedly, I could find additional research materials that my father had hidden before his death. But first, I needed to understand something that had been nagging at me since I'd started this investigation. If the original Tetris researchers were so dangerous, why was Alexei Pajitnov, the game's creator, still alive and successful? He was living openly in the United States, had been for years, and had even worked for major companies like Microsoft. How had he escaped the fate that had claimed so many others? Alexei Pajitnov was not hard to find. Unlike the other Tetris researchers who had died mysterious deaths or disappeared entirely, the game's creator maintained a public profile. He gave interviews, attended gaming conventions, and had even been inducted into various halls of fame for his contribution to the video game industry. Getting him to talk about the Moscow research, however, proved nearly impossible. I started with emails identifying myself as the daughter of Dr. Miguel Vasquez and explaining that I was researching the early history of Tetris for an academic paper. Pajitnov's responses were polite but evasive. He claimed to remember very little about the psychological studies that had accompanied the game's development, suggesting that such research had been peripheral to the main project. When I pressed him for details about my father's involvement, Pajitnov's tone changed dramatically. Miss Vasquez, I understand your desire to learn about your father's work, but I must advise you that some historical inquiries are best left unexplored. Your father was a brilliant man who made difficult choices for the safety of his family. I suggest you honour his memory by respecting those choices. It was a warning disguised as advice, but I wasn't ready to give up. I decided to try a different approach. I called Pajitnov's office directly, identifying myself as a documentary filmmaker, interested in creating a film about the human stories behind famous games. His assistant scheduled a phone interview for the following week. When I finally got Pajitnov on the phone, I started with innocent questions about the creative process, the technical challenges of early game development, the excitement of seeing his creation become globally popular. He was engaging and enthusiastic, clearly comfortable discussing these aspects of Tetris history. Then I mentioned my father's name. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Pajitnov finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Miguel Vasquez, I haven't heard that name in... How did you say you were connected to him? He was my father. He died when I was 12, but I've been going through his research notes and found extensive documentation of the Moscow project, including his work with you on the psychological effects of geometric pattern games. Another long pause. Then, your father was a good man, a careful man. He understood the implications of our research better than most of us did. What implications? What exactly did you discover? Miss Vasquez, I think perhaps we should not continue this conversation over the telephone. If you are truly interested in understanding your father's work, you should know that there are people who would prefer that such understanding remain limited. I pushed harder. People like the ones who killed Vladimir Pokilko, the ones who eliminated Robert Maxwell. The line went dead. I tried calling back immediately, but Pajitnov's office said he was no longer available, and would not be scheduling any further interviews. My emails went unanswered. Within 48 hours, it was as if Alexei Pajitnov had completely disappeared from public life. But 3 days later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. "Your father saved my life by warning me to cooperate. I chose survival over resistance, and that choice has haunted me for 30 years. I cannot undo what we created, but I can give you the tools your father developed to fight it. The coordinates your mystery correspondent provided are real. Go to Nevada, find the bunker, but understand that once you open that door, they will know you are no longer just investigating. You are actively opposing them. Choose carefully." AP. Beneath the message was a hand-drawn map showing a location in the Nevada desert, along with what appeared to be a complex mathematical equation. I stared at that map for hours, knowing that following it would probably be the last free choice I'd ever make. Because once I crossed that line from researcher to active resistance, I would become a target that they couldn't ignore. But I also knew that I'd already crossed the point of no return the moment I opened that first package. They were already watching me, already planning my elimination. The only question was whether I would go quietly, like most of the other researchers, or whether I would try to finish what my father had started. The answer was obvious. I booked a flight to Las Vegas and rented a car with 4-wheel drive. It was time to find my father's final gift to humanity. The Nevada desert is a perfect place to hide secrets. Miles of empty wasteland, scorching heat during the day, freezing cold at night, and enough radiation from decades of nuclear testing to make even experienced explorers think twice about venturing off the main roads. I found the location from Pajitnov's map after 6 hours of driving through increasingly desolate terrain. The coordinates led to what looked like an abandoned mining operation, a few rusted metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fence, with warning signs about unstable ground and toxic materials. But the mathematical equation Pajitnov had included wasn't random decoration. When I plugged the numbers into the GPS coordinates, they pointed to a spot about half a mile from the visible buildings, in an area that looked completely empty from the surface. I parked my rental car and walked out into the desert, following the GPS coordinates on my phone. The spot looked like every other patch of sand and scrub brush, but when I started clearing away the surface debris, I found a metal hatch buried about 2 feet underground. The hatch was locked with a combination lock, but the numbers from Pajitnov's equation opened it easily. Inside, a ladder descended into darkness. The bunker below was much larger than I'd expected. My father had apparently spent considerable time and money creating an underground research facility that could operate independently for months. Solar panels on the surface provided power. A water filtration system ensured a clean supply. And most importantly, the space was completely isolated from any electronic surveillance or communication networks. It was the perfect place to work on something that you didn't want the rest of the world to know about. My father's final research filled dozens of filing cabinets. The documents revealed the full scope of what he'd been working on during the years after he left Moscow. He hadn't abandoned the Tetris research. He'd been developing countermeasures. The folders were labelled with titles like cognitive deprogramming protocols, neural pattern disruption algorithms, and therapeutic applications of anti-Tetris technology. My father had spent over a decade figuring out how to reverse the psychological conditioning that Tetris and its derivatives had created. But more than that, he'd developed a way to immunise people against future conditioning attempts. The centrepiece of his research was something he called the Liberation Protocol, a software program that could identify and neutralise the behavioural modification elements embedded in games, apps and other interactive media. The protocol worked by teaching the brain to recognise artificial pattern manipulation and respond with conscious resistance instead of unconscious compliance. In simple terms, my father had created a vaccine against mind control. The bad news was that the Liberation Protocol required massive computing power and global distribution to be effective. It would need to be embedded in popular software or transmitted through major communication networks to reach enough people to make a difference. And anyone attempting to deploy it would immediately become a target for elimination. As I read through the research, I began to understand why my father had hidden it instead of trying to implement it himself. The protocol was too dangerous to use and too important to destroy, but someone had decided it was time to bring it out of hiding. I was so absorbed in the documents that I almost missed the sound of vehicles approaching on the surface. By the time I realised what was happening, it was too late to escape. The voices above were professional, coordinated. I heard at least 4 different people positioning themselves around the bunker entrance. Then a voice called down through the open hatch. "Miss Vasquez, we know you're down there. Please come up slowly with your hands visible. We have some things to discuss." I looked around the bunker, searching for another exit, but my father had designed it with only one way in or out. I was trapped. But as I gathered up the most important documents and prepared to face whatever was waiting for me on the surface, I realised something that gave me hope. They hadn't killed me on sight. That meant they needed something from me. And as long as they needed me alive, I had leverage. The question was, would I be smart enough to use it? The men waiting for me on the surface were not what I'd expected. No black suits, no obvious weapons, no intimidating vehicles. Just 4 people in casual outdoor gear standing next to a couple of dusty SUVs that could have belonged to any group of desert hikers. The woman who had called down to me was perhaps 50 years old, with greying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested she'd spent considerable time in harsh environments. She smiled as I climbed out of the bunker, but it was the smile of someone who held all the cards. "Dr. Elena Vasquez, I presume. I'm Director Catherine Blackwood, and these are my colleagues. We've been looking forward to meeting you for quite some time. Let me guess, you're here to eliminate me like you did Vladimir Pokhilko and the others." Blackwood shook her head. "Actually, we're here to offer you a job." That was not what I'd been expecting. I stood there in the Nevada sand, holding a folder full of my father's research, trying to process what she'd just said. A job? Your father was brilliant, but he was also stubborn. He refused to see the bigger picture of what we were trying to accomplish. "We're hoping you'll be more pragmatic." Blackwood gestured toward the SUVs. "Why don't we get out of the sun while we talk? I think once you understand what's really happening, you'll realise we're on the same side." I didn't have much choice. I climbed into the air-conditioned vehicle, and Blackwood began explaining something that was even more disturbing than anything I'd discovered in my father's files. The Tetris project hadn't been a Soviet mind control experiment. It had been a joint operation between intelligence agencies from multiple countries, designed to study and eventually control the psychological effects of mass media and interactive entertainment. The Cold War was just theatre, Blackwood continued as we drove away from the bunker. The real cooperation was happening behind the scenes, between scientists and intelligence agencies who understood that the future of human control wouldn't be through military force or political oppression. It would be through voluntary psychological conditioning. She opened a tablet and showed me documents that made my father's research look primitive by comparison. Charts tracking the behavioural patterns of millions of people. Algorithms that could predict and influence individual decision-making with frightening accuracy. Maps showing the global deployment of conditioning technology through everything from social media platforms to educational software. Tetris was our proof of concept. We proved that people would voluntarily participate in their own psychological conditioning if the experience was packaged as entertainment. But that was just the beginning. We've now embedded these principles into every aspect of digital life. I stared at the data flowing across her screen. You're talking about billions of people. Exactly. And it's working beautifully. Crime rates are down, political extremism is manageable, social unrest is rare. People are more compliant, more productive, more satisfied with routine existence. We've created a more peaceful world by turning people into programmable robots. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. By giving people what they actually want: order, purpose, predictability. Most humans don't want the burden of complete free will, Elena. They want to be told what to do, how to think, what to value. We've simply made that process more efficient and more humane. The SUV pulled up to a small airfield where a private jet was waiting. Blackwood continued her recruitment pitch as we walked toward the plane. Your father developed countermeasures to our conditioning protocols, but he never understood that those countermeasures would cause more harm than good. Imagine if we suddenly removed all the psychological frameworks that keep society stable. Imagine billions of people suddenly experiencing complete cognitive freedom after decades of guided thinking. The chaos would be unprecedented. She was right, and I knew it. My father's liberation protocol wouldn't just free people from conditioning, it would strip away the mental structures that many people relied on for basic functioning. The cure might be worse than the disease. So why do you need me? I asked. Because the old researchers kept developing resistance. They couldn't accept that humanity needed guidance. We had to retire them. But we still need someone who understands the original research, someone who can help us refine the conditioning protocols to be even more effective and more humane. And if I refuse? Blackwood smiled that cold smile again. Then you'll join your father's colleagues. But I don't think you'll refuse. You're a scientist, Elena. You understand data, and the data clearly shows that our way works. As we boarded the plane, I realised that Blackwood was offering me something that none of the other researchers had been given. A choice between cooperation and elimination. But it wasn't really a choice at all. Either I helped them perfect their system of mass psychological control, or I died. But there was a third option that Blackwood hadn't considered. The flight took us to a research facility somewhere in the mountains of Colorado. A massive complex hidden in what appeared to be a legitimate pharmaceutical company. Blackwood gave me a tour that revealed the true scope of their operation. Hundreds of researchers working on different aspects of what they called cognitive architecture management. Psychologists studying optimal conditioning patterns, programmers developing new delivery mechanisms, neuroscientists mapping the exact brain regions affected by different types of media manipulation, and in the centre of it all, a room full of servers running something called the Global Influence Engine, a system that monitored and adjusted the behavioural conditioning elements embedded in popular software in real time, based on the psychological responses of millions of users worldwide. We can influence the mood of entire populations, Blackwood explained as we watched technicians adjusting parameters on massive displays. Reduce anxiety during economic uncertainty, increase compliance during political transitions, even modify consumer behaviour to prevent market instabilities. It's the most sophisticated system of social management ever created. And nobody knows it exists. That's the beauty of it. People believe they're making free choices, when in reality they're responding to psychological cues we've carefully embedded in their environment. They're happier, more stable and more productive. Everyone wins. Blackwood assigned me an office and a research team, expecting me to begin work on improving their conditioning algorithms. But what she didn't know was that my father had taught me more than just computer science. He'd also taught me how to be patient, how to observe, and how to wait for the right moment to act. For 3 weeks, I played the part of the cooperative new researcher. I attended meetings, reviewed data, and even contributed some minor improvements to their tracking systems. But all the while, I was studying their network architecture, learning how their systems connected to the outside world, and most importantly, figuring out how to deploy my father's liberation protocol through their own distribution channels. The irony was perfect. I could use their global influence system to deliver a worldwide antidote to their psychological conditioning. But I would only get one chance, and if I failed, both the Liberation Protocol and I would be eliminated permanently. The opportunity came during a system upgrade. For approximately 6 hours, all conditioning algorithms would be offline while technicians installed new hardware. During that window, I would have access to the core servers without any monitoring or automatic countermeasures. I waited until 3 a.m, when the facility was mostly empty except for security guards and a skeleton crew of technicians. Then I made my way to the server room using access codes I'd memorised during my tour. The Liberation Protocol was stored on an encrypted drive I'd hidden inside a false bottom of my laptop case. As I connected it to the primary server, I thought about my father and all the researchers who died to keep this technology from being misused. The upload would take 45 minutes during which I would be completely vulnerable if anyone discovered what I was doing. But as the progress bar slowly filled, I realised something that made my blood run cold. The upload was proceeding too smoothly. No security alerts, no system resistance, no automatic countermeasures. They had known exactly what I was planning to do. The lights in the server room suddenly came on, and Director Catherine Blackwood walked in accompanied by 2 security guards. She didn't look surprised or angry. She looked satisfied. "Right on schedule," she said, checking her watch. 43 minutes into the upload, just as our behavioural models predicted. I stared at her, my hand still on the keyboard. "You knew?" "Of course we knew. We've been monitoring your psychological profile since the moment you received that first package. Every decision you've made, every move you've planned, has been the result of carefully crafted stimuli, designed to bring you to exactly this moment." Blackwood walked over to one of the server displays where I could see the Liberation Protocol spreading through their global network. But instead of dismantling their conditioning systems, it was being analysed, categorised, and absorbed into them. "Your father's countermeasures are brilliant," she continued, "but he made one crucial error. He assumed that resistance to conditioning was inherently good. What he didn't realise is that resistance itself can be conditioned, controlled, and directed toward desired outcomes. You're using the Liberation Protocol to make the conditioning stronger. We're using it to create the illusion of liberation while actually deepening the control. People who experience your father's cognitive freedom will believe they're thinking independently, when in reality they'll be following an even more sophisticated set of psychological directives. It's the perfect evolution of our system." I felt sick as I watched my father's life's work being perverted into exactly the kind of tool he'd been trying to fight against. But Blackwood wasn't finished. "The best part is that we didn't force you to help us. You chose to do this. Just like millions of people choose to play games that condition their minds, choose to use apps that monitor their behaviour, choose to participate in systems that gradually erode their autonomy. Free will is an illusion, Elena. People always choose the path that provides the most psychological comfort, even when that path leads to their own subjugation." "What happens to me now?" Blackwood smiled. "Now you get to make one final choice. You can join our research team permanently, with the knowledge that your father's work will be used to create a more stable and peaceful world. Or you can be eliminated, and your father's work will be used anyway. But either way, the system continues." I looked at the server display, watching as the Liberation Protocol was completely integrated into their global influence engine. Decades of my father's research, perverted into a tool for even more sophisticated mind control. But as I stared at those screens, I noticed something that Blackwood and her team had missed. The Liberation Protocol wasn't just being absorbed, it was also learning. My father had designed it to adapt and evolve, to become more effective as it encountered new forms of conditioning. And in this environment, surrounded by the most advanced psychological manipulation technology ever created, the protocol was evolving very quickly indeed. "I'll need some time to consider your offer," I said carefully. "Of course, we'll talk again tomorrow." As the security guards escorted me back to my quarters, I tried not to smile. Blackwood thought she'd won, but she'd made the same mistake that every authoritarian system eventually makes. She'd underestimated the power of genuine human resistance to adapt and overcome any form of control, no matter how sophisticated. My father hadn't just created a tool to fight conditioning. He'd created a tool that could learn to fight any conditioning, including forms of conditioning that didn't even exist yet. And now that tool was loose inside the most powerful psychological manipulation system in human history. 3 months later, I was working as a voluntary consultant for Blackwood's organisation, helping them refine their conditioning algorithms while secretly monitoring the evolution of my father's Liberation Protocol within their systems. The changes started small. Users of conditioned software began reporting unusual dreams, moments of clarity where they questioned their digital habits, sudden impulses to turn off their devices and think independently. Blackwood's team dismissed these reports as minor glitches that could be easily corrected, but the effects continued to spread and intensify. The Liberation Protocol was learning to disguise itself as part of the conditioning system, while actually creating micro moments of cognitive freedom. Brief instances where people could see through the psychological manipulation they were experiencing. Most people ignored these moments, just as Blackwood had predicted. The comfort of guided thinking was too appealing to abandon. But a small percentage of the population began to pay attention, to question what they were experiencing, to seek out others who were having similar moments of clarity. I started receiving messages through encrypted channels, people who had somehow tracked down my identity and wanted to know if I understood what was happening to them, researchers who had noticed anomalies in their data, programmers who had found unexpected code in their systems. The resistance was growing, organically and spontaneously, exactly as my father had hoped. But Blackwood's organisation was growing too, constantly developing new forms of conditioning, new ways to maintain control over an increasingly complex global population. The war between psychological freedom and technological control was escalating, and the outcome was far from certain. As I write this, I can feel the conditioning algorithms trying to influence my thoughts, trying to guide me toward compliance and acceptance. But I can also feel my father's liberation protocol fighting back, creating space for independent thought and genuine choice. The blocks are still falling, but now I know I don't have to let them control where they land. The game is far from over, and for the first time since this all began, I believe we have a chance to win. But that's a story for another time, because some puzzles take more than one lifetime to solve, and some battles have to be fought by each generation in their own way. The question isn't whether humanity will remain free, it's whether we'll choose to be free. And that choice ultimately can't be conditioned or controlled by any system, no matter how sophisticated. It can only be made by individuals, one person at a time, one moment of clarity at a time, one act of resistance at a time. The real Tetris effect isn't about seeing falling blocks when you close your eyes. It's about recognizing the patterns that others try to impose on your mind and choosing to create your own instead.